Your crown's too heavy. Your cousin's too quiet. Your soup tastes weird. You're not even sure where your army is. Welcome to being a medieval king, the most prestigious way to die early. This story topples into the brutal absurdity of medieval rulership, where wearing a crown mostly meant being poisoned slowly or stabbed quickly. We explore how kings were constantly under threat from uncles, bishops, kitchen staff, and their own children. Ruling required war, weddings, and wine fueled diplomacy, all while sitting on a chair that gave you hemorrhoids. Black humor sharpens every royal moment. Loyal knights who switch sides mid feast, nobles that smile while plotting your downfall, and ceremonial robes that made it impossible to pee discreetly. Compared to modern politics, medieval kingship was less leadership, more high stakes improv with a sword pointed at your back. The weight of the crown, it was said, was a burden few could truly comprehend. It was not merely the physical encumbrance of gold and jewels, though that was considerable enough. It was the crushing, all encompassing responsibility that settled upon a man's shoulders from the moment he inherited it, a mantle of lead that seemed to grow heavier with each passing year. This was not the glorious destiny sung by bards, nor the simple reign of a benevolent leader dispensing justice with a flick of his wrist. This was a life of perpetual unease, a gilded cage where the bars were forged from duty, expectation, and the ever present threat of ruin. Imagine, if you will, King Arthur, not astride a charger at Camlon, his sword Excalibur blazing with divine purpose, but slumped on a crude wooden stool in a drafty chamber, the chill seeping through his ermine-trimmed robes and settling into his very bones. His fingers, once adept at wielding a sword, now ached with the stiffness of age and the unending worry that coiled in his gut like a serpent. The fine linen of his tunic, meant to signify status and purity, felt like a shroud, the intricate embroidery a cruel mockery of the freedom he no longer possessed. Every decision, from the disposition of troops on a distant frontier to the allocation of grain in a famine-stricken village, rested squarely upon him. There was no delegation that truly absolved him, no adviser whose counsel was entirely trustworthy, no moment of respite from the relentless barrage of petitions, pronouncements, and pronouncements of impending doom. The castles themselves, these majestic fortresses that symbolized the king's power, were often no more than stone mausoleums, perpetually damp and echoing. The grandeur of the great hall, with its tapestries depicting heroic deeds of kings past, offered little solace against the gnawing draught that snaked under the ill-fitting doors. In his private chambers, the king was surrounded by the trappings of wealth, carved oak furniture, perhaps a few illuminated manuscripts carefully guarded from moisture, yet the sparseness remained. Comfort was a luxury rarely afforded, a frivolous indulgence in a life dedicated to the abstract notion of the realm. The flickering candlelight, meant to cast a warm glow, only served to deepen the shadows, mirroring the encroaching darkness of his own anxieties. Sleep, when it came, was a fitful thing, punctuated by the clang of the watchman's bell or the phantom whisper of a rival's plotting. The king was a man perpetually on edge, his senses tuned to the subtle shifts in the political climate as acutely as a farmer attuned to the changing winds before a storm. The weight of the crown was not a symbol of prestige, but a physical manifestation of the myriad burdens that pressed down upon him, crushing the man beneath the monarch. He was a prisoner of his own lineage, bound by oaths and traditions that, while meant to uphold his authority, ultimately served to strip him of his autonomy. The very fabric of his existence was interwoven with the fate of his kingdom, a terrifyingly tangible connection that allowed no room for personal error or even simple human frailty. The finest silks felt like coarse sackcloth against his skin. The richest foods tasted of ash in his mouth, for every indulgence was a reminder of the millions who hungered, and every moment of peace was shadowed by the knowledge that it was likely temporary. The crown was less a jewel-encrusted diadem and more a perpetual migraine, a constant throbbing ache behind the eyes that no amount of herbal poultice or priestly blessing could truly assuage. He was a man adrift in a sea of his own making, forever navigating treacherous currents, the distant shore of peace, an ever-receding mirage. The weight was unyielding, the anxiety a constant companion, and the freedom of a common serf to simply exist without the gaze of the world fixed upon his every breath was the most enviable luxury of all. This was the reality of kingship, a truth buried beneath layers of myth and minstrelsy, a gilded cage indeed, but one built from the very stone of his own responsibilities. The king, worn thin by the ceaseless gnawing of responsibility, often sought solace in the fleeting intimacy of shared confidence. In the heart of his castle, away from the echoing grandeur of the throne room and the hushed reverence of the chapel, there were moments when the monarch could shed, if only momentarily, the crushing weight of his title. He might share a jest, a private observation on the follies of his court, or even a whispered worry about the harvest or a border skirmish with those he deemed closest. His most trusted counselor, a man whose years of service had earned him a place at the king's elbow, was often the recipient of such moments of manufactured normalcy. The flickering candlelight, casting dancing shadows on the richly embroidered tapestries depicting ancient battles and triumphant kings, could lend an illusion of warmth and camaraderie. In these hushed exchanges, the king might allow himself a sigh, a rare loosening of the reins of perpetual caution. He would see in the attentive eyes of his adviser not the calculating gaze of a subject, but the mirrored reflection of his own burdens, the understanding of a fellow traveler on the perilous path of governance. It was in these stolen moments of apparent trust that the king truly hoped to find respite, a brief cessation of the unending vigilance that defined his waking hours and often his dreams. Yet, the very air of the court, thick with the scent of beeswax candles, polished wood, and expensive perfumed oils, was also saturated with the unspoken currents of ambition and betrayal. The loyalty so readily offered, so publicly proclaimed, was often a fragile thing, easily bartered for a whisper of favor or a promise of power. Even in the king's most private chambers, the very staff who attended to his needs, the valets who laid out his robes, the cupbearers who poured his wine, the pages who delivered messages, were not necessarily as they appeared. Each one, from the highest-ranking nobleman in his council to the humblest scullery maid, possessed their own desires, their own resentments, their own intricate webs of alliances and rivalries. The duke who advised him on matters of state might, in the same breath, be plotting with a rival faction, his honeyed words masking a venomous intent. The captain of the king's guard, whose sworn duty was to protect him, could be swayed by a well placed bribe or the allure of a more advantageous master. The king, though he knew this to be true in the abstract, could never truly allow himself to believe it of those who stood closest. To do so would be to succumb to a paralyzing paranoia, to see enemies in every face, and that, in itself, was a path to ruin. Consider for a moment the king and his most trusted adviser, Lord Boren, a man whose face was a roadmap of decades spent navigating the treacherous currents of royal politics. They might be seated by a crackling fire in a smaller solar, the great hall's boisterous revelry a distant murmur. The king, weary from a day of petitions and pronouncements, might lean back, a rare smile gracing his lips. Boren, he might say, his voice low, did you see the Duke of Northwood's absurdly puffed out chest today? He truly believes he outranks the very air he breathes. A shared chuckle, a moment of levity that felt as precious as a stolen jewel. Boren, his own expression, a mask of deference and mirth, would nod agreement, perhaps adding a wry observation of his own about the Duke's latest, ill conceived proposal. It was in these instances, these brief flashes of shared humanity, that the king felt truly alive, truly himself. But the tapestries on the walls, depicting scenes of ancient heroes and their unwavering loyalty, were silent witnesses to a different reality. As the king and Boren shared their quiet amusement, a shadowy figure might be slipping through a hidden passage, a discreetly placed ear pressed against a panel. Later that evening, under the cloak of a moonless sky, Boren would find himself in a clandestine meeting with the very Duke of Northwood, whose arrogance they had just mocked. The flickering candlelight in a remote hunting lodge, far from the prying eyes of the castle, would illuminate not camaraderie, but a pact forged in mutual ambition. Boren, the king's confidant, would relay the king's weariness, his anxieties about a particular trade negotiation, or even a casual remark about his younger son's suitability for a diplomatic posting. The Duke, in turn, would offer his support, his agreement to subtly undermine the king's plans, all for the promise of future influence, and a share of the spoils should the king's reign falter. The shared jest by the fire, meant to signify a bond, had become a tool of betrayal, its innocence twisted into a weapon. This was the perpetual tightrope walk of kingship. Every interaction, no matter how seemingly innocuous, was fraught with unspoken calculations. The king learned to read the subtle shifts in a courtier's posture, the flicker of an eye, the inflection of a voice, searching for any hint of insincerity. He would observe the seemingly casual conversations between his own trusted men, listening for any stray comment that might betray a hidden agenda. It was a skill honed through years of bitter experience, a constant, exhausting vigilance that never truly ceased. Even when surrounded by the familiar faces of those who had served him for decades, the king could not entirely banish the specter of doubt. Was the deference genuine or a carefully crafted performance? Was the loyalty a deep-seated conviction or a temporary alliance of convenience? The very architecture of the court, with its labyrinthine corridors, its hidden alcoves, and its strategically placed courtyards, seemed designed to facilitate secrets and intrigue. A seemingly innocent request for a private audience by a minor baron could be a prelude to a veiled threat or a desperate plea for patronage that, if granted, would alienate a more powerful faction. The lavish banquets, meant to foster unity and celebrate royal authority, were often arenas where alliances were subtly strengthened or broken, where favors were exchanged in hushed tones between courses, and where reputations could be subtly tarnished with a well placed rumor. A nobleman might propose a toast to the king's health, his words dripping with apparent sincerity, while his eyes, in a fleeting, almost imperceptible glance, would meet those of a rival, a silent communication passing between them, a shared understanding that the toast was merely a formality. The king's own household staff, those who moved within the most intimate circles of his life, were a constant source of unease. The butler who oversaw the dining hall, the chamberlain who managed the royal chambers, the jester whose very profession was to mock and reveal, all held positions of proximity and therefore potential influence. A jester, in the guise of humor, could plant seeds of doubt in the king's mind about a particular adviser or a looming threat from a neighboring kingdom. The king might laugh at the jester's witty barbs, his mirth echoing in the hall, but a part of his mind would be cataloging the suggestions, weighing their plausibility. The butler, privy to the king's dining habits and the conversations that occurred around his table, could subtly alter the king's perception of his own subjects by arranging seating charts that fostered division or by ensuring certain messengers arrived at inconvenient times. The king's personal physician, tasked with safeguarding his very lifeblood, was another figure whose proximity was a double edged sword. While ostensibly dedicated to the king's well being, such a position afforded an intimate knowledge of the king's physical vulnerabilities, his recurring ailments, and even his daily routine. A physician, motivated by greed or an ill conceived sense of greater good, could manipulate the king's medication, exacerbate his existing conditions, or even administer a subtle poison, all while maintaining the facade of devoted care. The king, already burdened by the weight of his crown, could not afford to be hypervigilant of his own doctors. To do so would be to invite a madness born of an all consuming suspicion. He had to trust, or at least pretend to trust, and that trust was a gamble, a wager against that ever present possibility of treachery. The king's confessor, the spiritual guide meant to steer his soul towards salvation, also occupied a unique and potentially dangerous position. The secrets confessed in the sanctity of the chapel, intended for the ears of God alone, were entrusted to a mortal man, while many priests and bishops were men of genuine piety. The allure of power, even spiritual power, was a potent temptation. A confessor could subtly influence the king's moral compass, guiding him towards decisions that favored his own ecclesiastical ambitions or those of his order. He could use the knowledge gained from private confessions to blackmail or manipulate the king, leveraging the fear of divine retribution to enforce his will. The king, seeking absolution and spiritual guidance, might find himself subtly manipulated, his conscience pricked not by divine law, but by the calculated interventions of a man with earthly designs. Even the king's own family members, those bound to him by blood, could not be entirely trusted. A queen, though married to the king, might harbor her own ambitions for her children or feel neglected and unappreciated, leading her to seek influence through clandestine alliances. Brothers, sons, and nephews, all positioned to inherit or to gain power in their own right, might see the king's reign as an obstacle to their own advancement. The most dangerous threats often came not from external enemies, but from those who shared the king's hearth, those who ate at his table, those whose hands he clasped in greeting. The court, a glittering stage for the performance of power, was also a breeding ground for vipers, each coiled and ready to strike when the moment was opportune. The king's isolation, therefore, was not merely a consequence of his elevated status, it was a necessity. He had to cultivate a certain detachment, a willingness to believe the worst of people lest he be blindsided by their perfidy. He learned to rely on his own judgment, to trust his instincts, to analyze every word and every gesture, searching for the hidden currents that flowed beneath the placid surface of courtly life. The illusion of trust was a fragile shield, and the king knew that at any moment it could shatter, leaving him exposed to the sharp edges of ambition and betrayal that lay in wait, ever ready to pierce through the gilded cage and claim their prize. The weight of the crown was not just the burden of governance, it was the ever present dread of the unseen enemy. The fear that the hand reaching out to offer comfort was the very hand that held the hidden dagger. The king's table, a veritable monument to the bounty of the realm, was in truth a gilded arena of constant peril. What appeared to be a celebration of prosperity, a testament to the king's power and the kingdom's fertility, was for him a meticulously orchestrated gamble with his own life. Each feast was a potent reminder of his gilded cage. The bars were not of iron, but of intricately carved wood and woven silk, and the guard was not a soldier, but a phantom, a possibility that lurked in every goblet and every morsel. The air, thick with the cloying sweetness of roasted swan, the earthy richness of venison stew, and the intoxicating aroma of spiced wines, carried with it an invisible, insidious threat. For the king, the true spectacle was not the jugglers or the troubadours, but the silent, unwavering scrutiny he maintained over every aspect of the meal. He would arrive at the banquet hall, his movements measured and deliberate, his gaze sweeping over the assembled nobility. Each face, from the haughtiest duke to the most obsequious courtier, was a cipher, a potential threat cloaked in the veneer of loyalty. The long oak tables, laden with enough food to feed a small army, were a landscape of potential betrayals. His own goblet, polished to a blinding sheen, was filled not by a servant at random, but by a carefully vetted member of his personal retinue, often a man whose fidelity had been tested through years of arduous service, or so the king tried to believe. Yet, even that assurance was a fragile thing. The cupbearer, a young man whose face was still unlined by the harsh realities of court intrigue, might be an unwitting pawn, his hand guided by a whispered instruction from a shadow lurking just beyond the torchlight. Or worse, he might be a willing participant, his youthful idealism corrupted by the intoxicating promise of power or coin. The king's eyes would follow the trajectory of the goblet from the serving dish to his lips, a silent internal drama playing out with every inch it traveled. The ritual of testing the food was a grim necessity, a daily performance of paranoia that drew veiled amusement or outright scorn from those who did not comprehend its life saving purpose. Before any dish reached his plate, it had to pass through the hands of his most trusted taster. This was no position of honor for the faint of heart. The taster, a man whose palate was as finely tuned as any musician's ear, would sample a minuscule portion of each offering, a sliver of the roasted boar, a spoonful of the savory broth, a crumb of the honeyed cake. He would then wait, his face a mask of studied calm, for any adverse reaction. A sudden pallor, a tremor in the hand, a bead of sweat on the brow, any sign that the food had been tampered with. The king observed this process with a grim intensity, a silent acknowledgment of the life hanging precariously in the balance, a life that was, in essence, the taster's. The taster's role was a morbid irony. He was paid to risk his life so that the king might continue to live, and in doing so, he became an extension of the king's own vulnerability, a living shield. Often, the king would feign a moment of absent mindedness, reaching for a piece of fruit or a morsel of cheese that had already been presented to him, only to have it swiftly intercepted by his taster. This was a public display, a subtle reinforcement of the king's awareness, a silent warning to any potential poisoner in their midst. The king's jester, however, was a more unconventional and perhaps more chilling participant in this grim theater. Known for his wit as sharp as a stiletto and his ability to speak truths cloaked in absurdity, the jester was also privy to the king's deepest anxieties. In the hushed solitude of the king's private chambers, far from the judging eyes of the court, the king might turn to his fool. Master Pip, he might say, his voice barely a whisper. This venison, does it hold the scent of mischief? And Pip, his motley costume a stark contrast to the king's regal attire, would approach the platter, his painted smile fixed, his eyes, however, holding a professional keenness. He would not taste the food directly, of course, but he had an uncanny knack for observing the subtle reactions of the royal taster, for catching the almost imperceptible wince or the flicker of unease that might escape the king's notice. Pip's role was not to detect the poison itself, but to gauge the taster's reaction, to provide a second layer of observation in a world where the first layer was always in doubt. He was the king's lie detector, a jester's cap adorned with the heavy weight of mortal consequence. The king's reluctance to partake of food or drink offered by anyone other than his most trusted inner circle was a constant source of awkwardness, a social friction that grated on the nerves of his courtiers. A nobleman, eager to curry favor, might present a beautifully crafted flagon of wine, a gesture of unparalleled generosity and respect. The king's polite refusal, his explanation that he had already been served, was not a slight but a survival mechanism. The nobleman's disappointment, though masked by a practiced smile, was a silent testament to the king's pervasive fear. It was a fear that cast a long shadow, turning acts of hospitality into potential acts of malice. The simple act of sharing a meal, a fundamental expression of human connection and communal well-being, had become a minefield for the king. Each shared dish, each raised goblet, was a tacit acknowledgement of the fact that those seated around him, those who laughed at his jokes and offered him their fealty, might also be contemplating his demise. The king's own cupbearer, a young man named Thomas, bore the brunt of this suspicion more than most. Thomas, a boy from a humble background who had risen through the ranks by sheer diligence and an earnest desire to serve, found himself under constant, unnerving scrutiny. His hands, steady and precise as he poured the king's wine, were also under the king's unwavering gaze. The king would watch as Thomas dipped the ladle into the carafe, as he filled the king's goblet, as he presented it with a humble bow. Was there a tremor in those hands that Thomas himself did not perceive? Was there a furtive glance towards someone else at the table, a silent signal of a completed task? The king, in his isolation, often found himself questioning the very fabric of reality, weaving elaborate narratives of conspiracy from the smallest, most innocent of gestures. He would ask Thomas questions, seemingly innocuous inquiries about his family, his hopes, his dreams, all while subtly observing the boy's demeanor, searching for any hint of deceit, any crack in the facade of loyalty. Thomas, he might say, his voice casual, your mother, is she well? You have not seen her in some time, I believe. And as Thomas responded, his eyes perhaps downcast in a show of respect, the king would study his pupils, seeking some telltale sign of distress or deception. The boy's earnest replies, his genuine affection for his ailing mother, were meant to reassure, but for the king, they were just another layer of performance, another potential deception to be deciphered. The lavishness of the royal banquets, the sheer abundance of food and drink, was intended to impress, to awe, and to solidify the king's image as a benevolent and powerful ruler. However, for the king, this very abundance was a source of his deepest dread. The greater the variety of dishes, the more opportunities for the poisoner to act. The more guests present, the more potential conspirators. Each course presented a new dilemma, a fresh wave of anxiety. He would watch the serving platters being carried through the hall, their contents often hidden beneath ornate silver domes. The unveiling of each dish was a moment of held breath, a silent anticipation of what might be revealed or what might have been introduced. He would note the way the servants handled the food, the careful placement of each portion on the royal plate, the swift removal of any uneaten remnants. It was a ballet of caution, a silent dance performed on the precipice of death. The king's isolation was never more profound than at these moments of supposed communal celebration. Surrounded by hundreds of his subjects, their faces upturned in feigned admiration or genuine respect, he was utterly alone. The laughter of the guests, the music of the minstrels, the clatter of silverware on porcelain, all of it served to highlight the vast chasm that separated him from everyone else. He was the sun around which his court revolved, but the sun in its solitary brilliance was also vulnerable to the cold vacuum of space. The more opulent the feast, the more acutely he felt this isolation, this chilling awareness of his own precarious existence. He was a prisoner in his own palace, and the banquet hall was merely a more ornate cell. The king learned to eat with a measured pace, to savor each bite not for its flavor, but for the confirmation that it was in fact safe. He learned to converse with a polite detachment, his mind constantly sifting through the possibilities, analyzing the subtlest shift in tone, the most fleeting expression, searching for the phantom that haunted his every meal. The feast was a testament to his power, yes, but more than that, it was a stark, unflinching reminder of the constant, gnawing peril that was the price of wearing the crown. The heavy velvet of the king's robe, embroidered with threads of pure gold that spoke of the kingdom's wealth and his own elevated status, did little to soften the ordeal that awaited him each time he was called to his throne. Far from the plush cushions and ergonomic designs of later eras, the royal seat was an object of imposing grandeur, yes, but of excruciating practicality. Carved from dense oak, its surface was smoothed, but not to the point of offering any real respite. The contours of the wood, designed to mimic flowing drapery and heraldic beasts, were in reality unforgiving ridges and valleys against the king's weary flesh. He would descend upon it with a practiced sigh, a subtle clench of his jaw, the only outward sign of the immediate discomfort. This was not merely a matter of fleeting inconvenience. Generations of monarchs, their portraits idealized and their lives mythologized, had endured this very affliction. The constant pressure, the friction against a perpetually seated posterior, inevitably led to ailments that were rarely spoken of in the hushed halls of power, yet were as common as the common cold. Hemorrhoids, those unwelcome and agonizing swellings, were a silent companion to the crown. Imagine the king, resplendent in his ermine-lined mantle, his brow furrowed in deep thought as he deliberates the fate of a rebellious province, all the while fighting a desperate internal battle against a searing, throbbing pain. He would shift, almost imperceptibly, his weight settling to one side, then the other, seeking a sliver of relief that never truly came. A subtle lean forward, a casual resting of an elbow on the armrest, might be an attempt to alleviate the pressure, a silent communication of his suffering to no one but himself. During a particularly tense diplomatic negotiation with the envoys from the northern territories, the king found himself utterly consumed by this physical torment. The treaty, a delicate balance of trade routes and military alliances, demanded his absolute focus. Yet, as the lead envoy droned on about tariffs and border skirmishes, the king's attention was irrevocably drawn downward. The rough weave of the wool cushioning beneath him seemed to snag and pull, each subtle movement sending a fresh wave of irritation through his already tormented body. He clenched his teeth, his knuckles white as he gripped the carved armrests. He saw in his mind's eye the intricate carvings of the throne, the snarling griffins and coiled serpents that adorned its legs and back. They seemed to mock him, these stoic guardians of his power, while his own flesh betrayed him with its insistent ache. He tried to maintain the regal facade, to project an image of unshakable authority and unwavering composure. He met the envoy's gaze directly, his voice steady as he offered a carefully worded response. But beneath the surface of this controlled performance, a battle raged. He yearned to squirm, to shift his position more dramatically, to perhaps even demand a cushion, a revolutionary act that would undoubtedly be perceived as a sign of weakness. The rich fabric of his hose, though fine in quality, offered little padding against the unyielding wood. The years of sitting on this very throne, punctuated by moments of forced immobility during lengthy ceremonies and court sittings, had taken their toll. The king was acutely aware of the irony. Surrounded by the symbols of his immense power and luxury, he was reduced to a basic, human struggle against physical pain. He imagined, with a morbid curiosity, The sheer variety of aches and pains that must have plagued his predecessors. Had King Alfred, stoic and learned, suffered in silence as he codified laws? Had William the Conqueror, a man of iron will, winced as he surveyed his newly won kingdom from this very seat? The weight of history, it seemed, was not just in the affairs of state, but in the shared, unspoken suffering of those who had occupied this throne before him. Each slight discomfort was a whisper from the past, a reminder that even the most powerful of men were subject to the indignities of the flesh. The textures themselves were a source of constant irritation. The polished wood, while smooth to the touch of a hand, offered no give to the unforgiving pressure of a seated body. The rough wool, perhaps intended for its durability and the rich hues it could hold, felt like 1,000 tiny needles pricking at his skin. Even the occasional, rare addition of a velvet cushion, often reserved for the most solemn of occasions, was a poor substitute for true comfort. The velvet itself, while luxurious, could be surprisingly slippy, and the stuffing beneath, often horsehair or straw, compressed quickly and offered little long-term support. The king would find himself constantly trying to readjust, to redistribute his weight, a subtle dance of avoidance that was as exhausting as it was undignified. He longed in these moments for the simple informality of a stool, a bench, even the soft grass of a meadow. But such peasant comforts were utterly beneath him. He was the king, and the throne was his due, a physical manifestation of his divine right. Yet the divine right, he was beginning to understand, came with its own set of burdens, some of them decidedly earthly and intensely personal. The very objects that proclaimed his majesty were also instruments of his discomfort. The heavy crown, for all its symbolic weight, pressed down on his temples. The richly embroidered robes, though magnificent to behold, were cumbersome and often stifling. And the throne, the very seat of his power, was a constant, physical reminder of his human vulnerability. The king's cough, a dry, hacking sound that he tried to stifle with a handkerchief, was another unintended consequence of his prolonged periods of immobility. The dusty air of the throne room, stirred by the movement of courtiers and the fluttering of banners, would invariably catch in his throat. He would often find himself trying to subtly clear his throat, a discreet cough that he hoped would go unnoticed, but which inevitably drew a few curious glances. It was a small thing, a minor annoyance, but it added to the cumulative weight of his physical discomfort. He was a man, after all, subject to the same bodily failings as any of his subjects, yet expected to present an image of near perfection. He would sometimes fantasize about a throne crafted from something softer, perhaps a densely packed moss or a specially treated leather. But such thoughts were flights of fancy, quickly dismissed. The traditions of royalty demanded a certain gravitas, a sense of enduring solidity. The throne had to be grand, imposing, and as it turned out, profoundly uncomfortable. It was a symbol of his station, yes, but it was also a throne of thorns, a constant nagging reminder that power, even when gilded and adorned, was rarely without its price. The physical pain was a subtle but persistent antagonist, a silent conqueror that chipped away at his composure, forcing him to fight for every moment of regal dignity. He would grip the armrest tighter, his jaw set, and breathe through the discomfort, a king enduring his own private torment in the heart of his magnificent, unyielding cage. The diplomacy would continue, the pronouncements would be made, and the king, his body a battlefield, would continue to rule, a prisoner of both his crown and his crucifying seat. The king's laughter, when it came, was a hollow sound, a strained exhalation that rattled in his chest like loose stones in a cart. It was the laughter of a man trying to convince himself and everyone within earshot that he was amused, that the sharp, pointed barbs of the jester's wit merely tickled his royal fancy. But beneath the veneer of mirth, a deeper, colder recognition flickered in his eyes. For Yorick, the king's fool, was more than just a purveyor of pratfalls and jingles. He was the court's canary in the coal mine, the harbinger of truths so unpalatable they had to be draped in the motley of buffoonery to be borne at all. Yorick, perched precariously on the edge of a gilded stool, his bells jingling a dissonant counterpoint to the king's strained chuckle, launched into his next jest. "And so, your majesty," he began, his voice a deliberately reedy caricature of a courtier's sycophancy. The good Duke Reginald, bless his perpetually pursed lips, was overheard lamenting the king's latest decree. He declared, with a most earnest frown, that the royal purse strings are being drawn tighter than a maiden's corset on her wedding eve. Yorick paused, his painted grin stretching impossibly wide, his eyes, however, darting to the king. "Of course," he added, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. He then proceeded to explain that this was a good thing, for it meant the king was merely preparing to fill those purse strings with even more plump coin. "A true testament to your foresight, sire." The king's smile faltered for a nanosecond before snapping back into place, more rigid than before. He nodded, a curt, almost imperceptible dip of his crowned head. The duke's dissatisfaction was no secret, of course. Whispers of his displeasure had reached the king's ears through more conventional and far more dangerous channels. But Yorick's phrasing, the sheer audacity of attributing such a veiled insult to a loyal subject, was disarming. It was a truth delivered with a poisoned sugar plum, sweet enough to be swallowed, but with a sting that lingered. Yorick, sensing the slight shift in the king's demeanor, pressed on, his performance escalating. He began to mime, his movements exaggerated, his body contorting as he depicted a grand feast. He pantomimed shoveling mountains of food into his mouth, his cheeks puffing out comically. Then, with a dramatic flourish, he pretended to gorge himself on invisible delicacies, his eyes rolling back in mock ecstasy. Suddenly, his body stiffened. He clutched his stomach, his face contorting in an expression of agonizing indigestion. He let out a series of guttural groans, each one more pathetic than the last, before collapsing onto the floor in a heap of bells and brightly colored fabric. "Alas," he wailed, his voice muffled by the plush carpet, "the king feasts like a king, with banquets that stretch from dawn till dusk. His coffers overflow, his granaries groan. Yet he managed to push himself up onto his elbows, his gaze fixed on the king's unguarded face. There are those who find their own plates quite empty." He then mimicked a starving man, his hand reaching out in a desperate plea, his fingers scrabbling at the air. Their bellies rumble like distant thunder, Their stomachs gnaw with the hunger of 1,000 wolves. And what do they hear? He put his hand to his ear, straining to listen. Only the echo of the king's own joyous consumption. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken anxieties. The courtiers, ever watchful, shifted in their ornate chairs, their eyes flicking between the prostrate jester and the unnervingly still king. The king's hands, which had been resting on the arms of his throne, now gripped them tightly, his knuckles white. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that Yorick was not merely jesting. The king's lavish spending, while necessary to maintain the outward appearance of prosperity and power, was indeed draining the kingdom's reserves at an alarming rate. And there were murmurs, not just of discontent, but of outright rebellion, simmering in the darker corners of the realm. Yorick, seeing the king's rigid posture, scrambled back to his feet, his usual agility returning. He bowed low, his bells performing a frantic jig. "But fear not, your majesty," he declared, his voice regaining its usual raucous cheer. "For even in their hunger, these poor souls can find solace. They can gaze upon your magnificent glory, your resplendent robes, your crown that shines brighter than 1,000 stars, and know that someone is well fed." He winked, a gesture that was both impudent and strangely comforting. And is that not enough? Is the mere sight of prosperity not a feast in itself for the famished soul? The king forced another laugh, a sound that was more a gasp for air. It was the kind of laughter that arose from sheer desperation, a dam holding back a torrent of fear and frustration. He had to acknowledge the jester's performance, to reward the effort, lest Yorick's unusually pointed insights be interpreted as insubordination, or worse, as a challenge. But the jester's words, like a skilled assassin's blade, had found their mark. The king was keenly aware of the growing unrest, the resentment that festered among the common folk and even within the nobility, who felt the pinch of his extravagant policies. Yorick, undeterred by the king's barely disguised discomfort, continued his routine, weaving a tapestry of dark humor that mirrored the anxieties of the court. He spoke of a phantom knight, clad in armor made of hollow promises and reinforced with the brittle bones of forgotten treaties. This knight, Yorick explained with a dramatic shudder, would gallop through the countryside, his sword dripping with the tears of widows, and his shield emblazoned with the crest of broken oaths. And when the common man asks him, "Sir Knight, what message do you bring?" the phantom replies. Yorick lowered his voice to a menacing growl. "I bring the message of the silent tongue, the clenched fist, and the whispered curse." He then broke into a series of frenzied, jerky movements, his bells a chaotic clatter, before abruptly freezing, his eyes wide with mock terror. "And then," he whispered, "he vanishes, leaving only the chill of his passing and the gnawing fear of what he might have done." The king's forced amusement was a fragile thing, a delicate bloom wilting under an unexpected frost. He understood the allegory all too well. The phantom knight was the embodiment of discontent, the silent, growing threat that loomed over his kingdom. The whispered curses were the very conversations happening in taverns and marketplaces, fueled by hunger and hardship. Yorick, in his outlandish costume and painted smile, was the only one who could articulate these fears without directly accusing anyone, least of all the king himself. The jester's art was a dangerous tightrope walk. He could, with a single misplaced word, find himself stripped of his bells and banished, or worse, but it was precisely this proximity to danger that gave his words their power. He operated in a realm where hyperbole and absurdity were the currency, and in that realm he could speak truths that the most eloquent statesman dared not utter. He was a mirror, reflecting the king's own anxieties and the kingdom's hidden pains, but a mirror warped and twisted so that the ugliness was both undeniable and somehow bearable. And so, Your Majesty, Yorick concluded his latest skit, bowing with a flourish that threatened to send him tumbling. We must always be wary of those who whisper sweet nothings while sharpening their daggers, for a kingdom built on a foundation of grumbles and groans, he tapped his own hollow chest for emphasis, is a kingdom as stable as a drunken acrobat on a greased pole. He then launched into a jaunty tune, his bells a triumphant, if somewhat manic, peal. The king offered another strained laugh, this one a little more genuine, a flicker of amusement breaking through the tension. Yorick's absurd analogies, his unflinching portrayal of the kingdom's woe through the lens of exaggerated foolishness, were a necessary release. In a world where every word was weighed and measured, where a single misspoken phrase could have dire consequences, Yorick was an anomaly. He was the valve that let off the pressure, the safety net that caught the king before he plunged into the abyss of despair. The jester's words, however, were not always designed to amuse. Sometimes they were designed to warn. Yorick, in his erratic ramblings, had begun to weave a new narrative. He spoke of a shadow that crept through the royal gardens at midnight, a shadow with many heads, all hungry for power. He described this shadow as a creature that whispered poison into the ears of the sleeping and painted treacherous dreams onto the eyelids of the powerful. He acted out the shadow's approach, his movements slow and serpentine, his voice a sibilant hiss. It slithers, sire, he rasped, his eyes wide. It coils around the ankles of loyalty, and its bite is the cold kiss of betrayal. The king's amusement had entirely evaporated. He sat bolt upright, his gaze fixed on Yorick, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. The many heads spoke of a cabal, a conspiracy. The poisoned whispers and treacherous dreams were not mere flights of fancy. They were the insidious tactics of those who sought to undermine his authority. He remembered the hushed conversations he had overheard in the corridors, the veiled glances exchanged between certain nobles, the sudden reticence of advisers who had once been effusive in their loyalty. Yorick, sensing he had struck a sensitive chord, continued his pantomime. He mimicked whispering into an invisible ear, his face contorted in a mask of feigned sincerity. Then he mimicked a noble receiving this whispered counsel, his chest puffing out with arrogance, his hand reaching for a phantom sword hilt. He hears, Yorick croaked, his voice shifting into a guttural growl, the promise of greater glory, the allure of a different king, a king who will share the bounty. He then pretended to pledge his fealty to this phantom king, bowing with an exaggerated servility that was both grotesque and chilling. The king's heart pounded against his ribs. This was more than just general discontent. This was specific. There were those actively working against him, sowing seeds of dissent and plotting his downfall. Yorick, in his madness, had stumbled upon the truth, or at least a significant part of it. The jester, the one person in the court who was meant to be immune to the poisoned chalice of political intrigues, had become its unwilling messenger. And when the king's guard, ever vigilant, asks the shadow, "Who are you? What business have you here?" the shadow merely laughs. Yorick threw his head back and let out a cackling, unholy sound. It laughs and says, "I am the whisper in the wind, the doubt in the heart, the ambition in the soul, and my business is to make your kingdom mine." Yorick then, with a sudden, sharp movement, lunged forward as if to snatch the crown from the king's head. He stopped just short, his hand hovering inches above the royal diadem, his painted grin a rictus of mock malevolence. The king flinched, a genuine tremor running through his body. He looked at Yorick, his fool, his jester, his confidant in the most unconventional sense. He saw not just the bells and the motley, but the eyes, sharp and intelligent, that saw through the gilded cage to the fear and vulnerability within. He saw the courage it took to speak these truths, to dance on the edge of treason for the sake of a king who, for all his power, was also a man trapped by his own majesty. He had to respond, not with anger, not with dismissal, but with the acknowledgement that such warnings, however delivered, could not be ignored. He forced a smile, a tired, knowing expression that held no trace of genuine amusement. "Yorick," he said, his voice low and steady, "your tongue, it seems, is sharper than your bells." Yorick, still frozen in his mock assault, blinked his wide painted eyes. "But, sire," he said, his voice suddenly soft, almost mournful, "even sharp tongues can be silenced, and a kingdom that ignores its fool." He lowered his hand, his bells falling silent for the first time in minutes, "is a kingdom doomed to repeat its mistakes. And worse, sire." He met the king's gaze directly, his usual buffoonery replaced by a profound sadness. "It is a kingdom doomed to forget the lessons that only pain can teach." The king leaned back, the rough wood of his throne pressing into his weary flesh. He had ordered the jester to entertain, to lighten the mood. Instead, Yorick had provided him with a chilling premonition, a glimpse into the darkness that coiled around the throne. The jester's bitter truths, wrapped in the absurdity of his role, were a stark reminder that even in the most opulent of gilded cages, the bars of reality were always present, and the threats to freedom, both royal and personal, were ever watchful. The king's forced laughter had long since died, replaced by a grim understanding. He was not just a king, he was a target, and his fool, in his own peculiar way, was his first and perhaps only line of defense. The silence that fell upon the throne room was not the silence of respect, but the heavy, expectant hush of a kingdom holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable storm. Yorick, the jester, had done his job. He had spoken the truth, however bitter, and now the king was left to grapple with its chilling implications. The king's uncle, the venerable Duke Armand, cleared his throat, a sound that, though seemingly innocuous, carried the weight of generations of ambition. He sat at the far end of the long oak council table, his silvered beard immaculately groomed, his robes of deep velvet embroidered with the royal crest, speaking of a lineage as ancient and deep rooted as the castle's very foundations. His eyes, however, held a glint that belied the benevolent facade of elder statesmen. They were the eyes of a hawk, ever watchful, ever assessing, ever waiting for the opportune moment to strike. Before him, the maps lay spread, detailing the northern provinces, their borders a delicate, often contested line on the vellum. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, depicting scenes of triumphant ancestors, cast kaleidoscopic patterns across the polished wood, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, each one a tiny transient particle in the grand, enduring theater of power. My dear nephew, Armand began, his voice a smooth, resonant baritone like a cello's deep hum. The situation in the northern marches requires our most careful consideration. These incursions by the northern tribes, while perhaps minor skirmishes for now, are like the gnawing of rats at a granary. If left unchecked, they will surely deplete our stores and weaken the very walls that protect us. He gestured with a long, tapered finger towards a point on the map, a region designated by a crude drawing of a fortified settlement. The garrison there, under young Count Valerian, is bravely holding the line, but his reports speak of dwindling supplies and a certain weariness amongst his men. King Henri, seated at the head of the table, his brow furrowed in concentration, nodded slowly. Valerian was a distant cousin, a young man of commendable spirit, but perhaps lacking the hardened experience required for such a volatile frontier. Henri had recently dispatched additional provisions, but the sheer distance and the harsh terrain made regular resupply a Herculean task. He glanced at his uncle, seeking a more concrete suggestion, a strategic proposal that would address the issue with the decisiveness befitting a royal council. Armand leaned forward, his expression one of grave concern, the very picture of a loyal adviser. It is my considered opinion, Your Majesty, he continued, his voice dropping to a more intimate, almost conspiratorial tone, that a personal visit from a royal envoy might bolster their spirits and, more importantly, convey the seriousness with which we regard this threat. Someone of high standing, someone whose very presence would signify the crown's unwavering commitment. He paused, allowing his gaze to sweep across the faces of the other counselors, each a flicker of recognition in their eyes. Perhaps, he added, his gaze finally settling on Henri with a subtle, almost imperceptible emphasis, someone who understands the burdens of command, the sacrifices required to maintain order. The unspoken implication hung heavy in the air. Armand, though a duke and the king's uncle, held no official position within the Regency Council. Yet, his influence was undeniable, his counsel sought by many, his opinions often treated as royal decrees. His subtle suggestion was a masterful stroke. To send him as the envoy would place him in a position of direct authority, allowing him to assess the situation on the ground, to potentially rally forces, and crucially, to garner personal loyalty from those on the frontier. It was a move that subtly undermined Henri's direct command, creating a parallel power structure, a shadow of authority that could, in time, eclipse his own. Henri felt a prickle of unease. He trusted his uncle's loyalty. At least he told himself he did. Armand had been a staunch supporter of his father, the late king, and had always presented himself as a pillar of the realm's stability. But the jester's words, still echoing in the recesses of his mind, about shadows and whispers and ambition, returned with an unwelcome clarity. Could his uncle, in his desire to help, be seeking to position himself in a way that would make Henri appear indecisive, or worse, dependent? An envoy, Henri mused, his voice carefully neutral. Who do you suggest, uncle? Lord Beaumont is currently engaged in the southern territories, and Baron de Valois has his hands full with the coastal defenses. He was subtly pushing back, reminding Armand that the choice of envoy was ultimately his, the king's. Armand's smile remained fixed, unwavering. Indeed, Your Majesty, the available options are limited by current commitments. However, he inclined his head slightly, a gesture of respect that felt increasingly disingenuous. There is always the options of a more direct approach. I myself, as you know, have considerable experience in matters of border security. My own estates, though not bordering the northern tribes directly, are managed with a firm hand, and I have always kept a keen eye in military matters. I would be willing to undertake such a mission if you deem it wise. He paused, his eyes meeting Henri's, a challenge veiled in feigned humility. My loyalty to the crown and to you, my nephew, is beyond question. I would go not for glory, but for duty. The silence that followed was punctuated only by the crackling of the fire in the hearth, the flames dancing with an unsettlingly vibrant intensity. Other counselors shifted uneasily. Lord Chancellor Thorn, a man of precise speech and cautious temperament, cleared his throat. Your Grace, Thorn began, his voice carefully measured, while your willingness to serve is, as always, commendable, the Council believes that a more seasoned commander, one with recent battlefield experience, might be better suited to such a delicate mission. Perhaps Lord Reginald's nephew, Sir Callan, who has seen service in the Low Countries. Armand waved a dismissive hand, his smile tightening. Warky Sir Callan, he scoffed, though the sound was low and almost inaudible, is a fine young man, no doubt, but his experience lies in skirmishes with disciplined armies, not in the unpredictable nature of tribal warfare. Besides, he added, his tone shifting to one of patronizing concern, he is still young. Such a responsibility might prove too great for his shoulders. I, on the other hand, have weathered political storms and military challenges for far longer than he has been alive. My judgment is seasoned, my resolve tested. Henri's jaw tightened. The veiled insult to Sir Callan, and by extension to Lord Reginald, was clear. Armand was not merely offering his services. He was actively undermining potential rivals, consolidating his own influence by subtly discrediting others. This was not the counsel of a loyal uncle, but the calculated maneuvering of a man who saw an opportunity to expand his power base. Uncle, Henri said, his voice deliberately calm, though a cold anger was beginning to simmer beneath the surface. Your experience is indeed invaluable. However, the northern marches are a complex matter. While your estates are well managed, the tactics employed by these tribes are unlike anything encountered in your own territories. I have received reports that they favor swift raids and ambushes, tactics that require not just experience, but a certain agility of mind, a certain adaptability that may not be readily apparent in one who has spent his years in the gilded halls of court. He saw a subtle flicker of surprise, quickly masked in Armand's eyes. Henri was not merely deflecting, he was subtly questioning Armand's preparedness, playing on his perceived lack of recent, relevant experience. It was a dangerous game to challenge an elder, a relative, especially one as influential as Armand. But Henri felt he had no choice. The jester's words about shadows and ambition were too vivid to ignore. Armand recovered smoothly, his smile widening, revealing a flash of teeth. Adaptability, Your Majesty? My dear nephew, I have adapted to many things in my long life. I have seen kings rise and fall, alliances forged and broken. I have navigated the treacherous currents of court politics and emerged not unscathed, but unbroken. These northern tribes, he chuckled, a dry, rustling sound, are but children playing with sharp sticks compared to the wolves I have faced in my time. Do not underestimate the wisdom that comes with age, or the steel that is forged through experience, even if that experience is not always publicly displayed. The subtle insinuation that his own experience was somehow hidden, or perhaps even superior to whatever Henri might have witnessed, was a clear jab. It was a declaration of inherent superiority, a subtle assertion of a right to rule that went beyond his familial connection. The air in the council chamber grew thick with unspoken tension, the opulent surroundings of gilded carvings and rich tapestries suddenly feeling like the gilded bars of a cage. Your wisdom is indeed a gift, uncle, Henri replied, his tone now laced with a cool formality that bordered on frost, and I shall certainly consider your offer. However, before we make any final decisions regarding the envoy, I wish to hear the opinions of others. Lord Chancellor Thorn, you mentioned Sir Kalen. What are his strengths, specifically in relation to this northern threat? Thorn, sensing the subtle shift in the king's demeanor, seized the opportunity. Sir Kalen, Your Majesty, possesses a keen understanding of irregular warfare. His campaigns in the Low Countries, while against organized armies, involved significant elements of surprise, counterinsurgency tactics, and the necessity of maintaining morale in difficult conditions. He is known for his quick thinking and his ability to adapt to rapidly changing battlefield situations. Furthermore, he has a natural affinity with the common soldier, a quality that might prove invaluable when dealing with weary garrisons. Armand's smile had thinned considerably. The direct praise of Sir Kalen's suitability was a blow to his carefully constructed strategy. He saw his chance to gain influence slipping away, to be replaced by a younger man whose competence, though perhaps genuine, was a direct challenge to his own perceived indispensability. A common soldier's affinity, Armand murmured, his voice dripping with disdain. A commendable trait for a captain of foot, perhaps, but hardly the quality one seeks in a royal envoy tasked with assessing high-level strategic matters. One needs a mind that understands the broader implications, the diplomatic nuances, the long-term consequences of our actions. One needs a mature perspective. He fixed his gaze on Henri, the unspoken accusation clear. You are too young, too inexperienced to understand these nuances. You need me. Henri felt a surge of defiance. He would not be cowed by his uncle's veiled pronouncements of superiority. He knew his own limitations, but he also knew his own mind. The jester's warnings about ambition and usurpation felt less like fanciful tales and more like stark realities unfolding before his very eyes. Mature perspective, Henri repeated, his voice measured and calm, though his gaze was unwavering. Indeed, and it is precisely that mature perspective, coupled with a clear understanding of the current strategic landscape, that I am seeking. Therefore, I have decided. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle, allowing the anticipation to build. I shall dispatch Sir Kalen as my personal envoy to the northern marches. He will assess the situation, confer with Count Valerian, and report back directly to me. Furthermore, Henri continued, his gaze now fixed on his uncle, a glint of steel in his eyes. I believe it would be prudent for Duke Armand to remain here at court. Your insights and counsel are always valued, uncle, and I have several important matters regarding the royal treasury and the upcoming trade negotiations that require your immediate attention. The color drained from Armand's face, his carefully constructed composure fracturing for a fleeting instant. The dismissal, polite yet firm, was a public humiliation, a clear signal that his attempt to maneuver himself into a position of power had failed. He had been outmaneuvered, not by a seasoned diplomat or a cunning rival, but by his own nephew, the king he had so subtly sought to sideline. The opulent chamber, moments before a stage for his ambitions, now felt like a courtroom where his machinations had been laid bare. As your majesty commands, Armand said, his voice tight, the smooth baritone now strained and brittle. He bowed his head, the gesture stiff and perfunctory. He rose from his seat, his velvet robes rustling with suppressed fury, and swept from the chamber, leaving behind a palpable silence that spoke volumes about the simmering animosity and the ever-present struggle for power within the royal family. Henri watched him go, a cold resolve settling in his heart. The art of the royal gambit was indeed a dangerous game, and his uncle had just made his first move, a move that Henri had met with a calculated counter. The blood ties that bound them were undeniable, but the hunger for the crown, that ancient primal drive, had proven to be the far stronger current. The game, Henri knew, had only just begun. The aftermath of the council meeting left Henri with a gnawing disquiet, a feeling amplified by the jester's chilling pronouncements. His uncle, Duke Armand, had been publicly dismissed, a move that, while satisfying Henri's immediate need to assert authority, felt more like a temporary reprieve than a victory. The Duke's icy departure, his forced civility a thin veneer over barely contained fury, was a stark reminder that the power struggle was far from over. Henri found himself staring at the polished surface of the council table, tracing the intricate grain of the wood, his mind replaying the subtle barbs, the veiled insults, the calculating pronouncements of his uncle. The loyalty of his court, he realized with a growing certainty, was a fickle mistress, as easily swayed as the banners in a strong wind. This realization was soon to be tested in the most public and dramatic fashion. The annual summer tournament, a tradition designed to showcase chivalry, celebrate martial prowess, and crucially, foster loyalty among the kingdom's knightly orders, was just days away. It was an event eagerly anticipated by the populace, a spectacle of gleaming armor, thundering hooves, and the clash of steel that stirred the hearts of commoner and noble alike. For Henry, it was also an opportunity to gauge the true allegiance of his most powerful vassals and knights. He had planned to use the tournament to reaffirm his strength, to rally support for the northern campaign, and to subtly assess the mettle of those who pledged him their swords. The king's champion, Sir Gareth of the Iron Hand, was meant to be the centerpiece of this display. Renowned throughout the kingdom for his unblemished record, his unwavering devotion, and his formidable skill with the lance, Gareth was the epitome of knightly virtue. His allegiance was considered absolute, his loyalty a bedrock upon which Henri felt he could rely. Gareth was a man of few words, his actions speaking louder than any pronouncements of fealty. His presence alone was expected to inspire confidence, to demonstrate that even in the face of external threats, the kingdom's martial strength remained unshakable. The day of the tournament dawned bright and clear, the sky a vast canvas of cerulean blue, dotted with fluffy white clouds. The royal colors, azure and gold, fluttered from every turret and rampart of the castle. The jousting grounds, a broad swathe of well-trodden earth outside the city walls, were already thronged with spectators. Merchants hawked their wares, colorful banners snapped in the breeze, and the air thrummed with anticipation. From the royal box, adorned with velvet and ermine, Henri and his entourage surveyed the scene. The king, though outwardly composed, felt the familiar tremor of anxiety that accompanied any public display of power. Beside him, his advisers offered murmured comments, their eyes scanning the assembled knights, each an implicit judge of their king's standing. The procession of knights began, a breathtaking spectacle of martial pageantry. Each jouster, resplendent in polished armor, rode before the royal box, their helms lowered in salute. The crowd roared its approval, the collective voice a powerful tide of emotion. Sir Gareth, when his turn came, was a sight to behold. Mounted on a magnificent destrier, his armor gleamed like a polished mirror, his shield emblazoned with the royal lion rampant. He carried the king's favor, a silk ribbon of azure, tied around his lance. As he passed the royal box, he paused, raising his lance in a deep, respectful bow. Henri felt a surge of pride, a brief, hopeful affirmation of his kingdom's strength. Gareth was indeed his most trusted warrior, a symbol of the order and stability he strove to maintain. The jousts commenced, the initial bouts proceeding as expected. Lances splintered, knights were unhorsed, and the crowd cheered and gasped with each decisive blow. Henri found himself drawn into the drama, the anxieties of the council chamber momentarily forgotten in the thrill of the competition. Then it was time for the final, most anticipated match. Sir Gareth against Sir Callan, Lord Reginald's formidable nephew, the very knight Henri had recently dispatched to the northern marches. This was a contest between proven loyalists, a demonstration of the kingdom's finest martial talent. The two knights circled each other, their lances lowered, the tension in the air almost palpable. The crowd held its breath. Henri leaned forward, his gaze fixed on the approaching riders. Gareth, A blur of silver and azure surged forward. Kalen met him head on, the impact a thunderous crack that echoed across the field. Both knights held their seats, but it was Gareth who had delivered the more decisive blow, his lance striking Kalen's shield with such force that the younger knight swayed precariously in his saddle. A cheer erupted from the royalist contingent, but it was swiftly cut short by a sudden, shocking turn of events. As Gareth wheeled his horse around for the next pass, his gaze, instead of focusing on his opponent, flickered towards a small elevated pavilion situated on the far side of the jousting grounds. Within it, Henri could just make out the figure of Duke Armand, seated with a group of his own retainers, their expressions impassive. Then, in a move that defied comprehension, Sir Gareth veered sharply away from Sir Kalen. His lance, still held high, dipped, not towards his intended opponent, but towards the royal box. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath. Before anyone could react, before Henri could even register the impossible trajectory of the lance, it struck. It wasn't a direct hit on Henri, thank God, but it slammed into the royal standard pole, shattering the wood and sending the azure and gold banner tumbling to the ground. The effect was immediate and devastating. A stunned silence descended upon the jousting grounds, quickly followed by a ripple of confusion that spread like wildfire. Knights hesitated, grooms pulled their horses back, and the roar of the crowd turned into a murmur of shocked disbelief. Sir Gareth, his face hidden behind his helm, did not stop. He spurred his horse, not towards Kalen, nor towards the king, but directly towards Duke Armand's pavilion. He dismounted before it, tore the king's favor from his lance, and tossed it contemptuously onto the ground before the duke, who, for the first time, allowed a slow, triumphant smile to spread across his face. The symbolism was unmistakable, a brutal, public declaration of betrayal. Gareth, the king's champion, the epitome of loyalty, had just declared his allegiance to Armand. The implications were terrifying. If Gareth, a man whose loyalty was considered beyond reproach, could be swayed, then who else could be trusted? The carefully constructed edifice of Henri's authority seemed to crumble around him in that single, shattering moment. The clang of steel on steel had been replaced by the deafening silence of broken oaths and the sickening thud of a king's trust being irrevocably shattered. The tournament dissolved into chaos. Knights who had been honoring Henri with their participation suddenly looked uncertain, their gazes flicking towards Armand's pavilion, then to the king's stunned face. Factions began to form, subtle shifts in posture and allegiance. Some knights, their loyalty perhaps always wavering, began to edge away from the royal box. Others, particularly those who had benefited from Armand's patronage or who harbored their own ambitions, openly gravitated towards the Duke. The carefully orchestrated display of unity had become a public spectacle of division. Henri felt a cold dread creep into his heart. This was not merely a defection. It was a calculated, devastating blow. Armand, unable to wrest control through direct counsel, had orchestrated a public humiliation, a demonstration that he could command the loyalty of even the most trusted figures in the kingdom. Gareth's defection was a powerful message. Loyalty was a commodity to be bought and sold, and Armand was a willing buyer. Sir Kalen, his face a mask of shock and anger, had remained on the field, his lance still raised, his stance defiant. He looked towards Henri, his unspoken question clear. "What now, your majesty?" Henri met his gaze, a flicker of grim determination in his own eyes. The jester's words about shadows and ambition echoed in his mind, no longer metaphorical warnings, but stark, terrifying truths. His uncle was playing a dangerous game, a game of chess with the kingdom as the board and its people as the pieces. Henri knew with a chilling certainty that he had just lost a knight, but he had also gained a clear understanding of the depth of his uncle's ambition and the fragility of his own hold on power. The tournament, meant to be a symbol of his strength, had instead exposed his vulnerability, leaving him to navigate a kingdom where even the most celebrated champions could turn their lances against their sovereign. The implications of Gareth's public betrayal sent shockwaves through the assembled ranks. Knights, once proud participants in the king's tournament, now found themselves in an unenviable position. The subtle currents of allegiance, previously flowing towards Henri, now seemed to eddy and swirl, pulled by the gravitational force of Armand's audacious move. Many of those present had pledged their service and their lives to the crown, but the spectacle of Sir Gareth, the king's champion, publicly casting aside the king's favor for the duke's implied favor, was a powerful testament to the shifting tides of power. Loyalty, it seemed, was not an immutable virtue, but a fluid allegiance, susceptible to persuasion, to the promise of greater favor, or perhaps simply to the allure of a more dominant force. The crowd, initially bewildered, began to react. The deafening roar of anticipation transformed into a cacophony of murmurs, whispers, and increasingly shouts of support for either the king or the duke. Small groups of knights began to break away, their armor glinting as they gravitated towards Armand's pavilion, their movements betraying a newfound confidence. The duke, for his part, remained seated, his expression unreadable, yet his very stillness seemed to radiate an aura of triumph. He had not uttered a word, had made no grand pronouncement, yet his influence had just been demonstrated in the most dramatic fashion possible. He had proven that he could command the loyalty of those who mattered, those who held the swords and wore the armor. Henri watched this disintegration of order with a growing sense of dread. His carefully laid plans for the tournament, intended to solidify his authority and rally support for the northern campaign, had backfired spectacularly. He had underestimated his uncle's capacity for ruthless pragmatism, his willingness to exploit any weakness, any perceived disloyalty. Gareth's defection was not an isolated incident. It was a carefully orchestrated signal, a beacon to any who harbored doubts or ambitions of their own. The very foundation of his rule, the implicit trust placed in his knights, had been shaken to its core. Sir Callan, his lance still held aloft, his posture a picture of unwavering loyalty, looked to Henri for direction. His presence was a stark contrast to the defections occurring around them. Callan, a man forged in the crucible of difficult campaigns, was not easily swayed by displays of power or wealth. His loyalty was born of duty, of a genuine belief in the legitimacy of the crown. Henri recognized this, and in that moment, a fragile alliance of true conviction began to form between the young king and his capable knight. Sir Callan, Henri's voice, though strained, was firm, cutting through the rising tide of confusion. Lower your lance. The tournament is concluded. Escort me back to the castle. The command was delivered with a quiet authority, a desperate attempt to regain some semblance of control. The knights loyal to Henri, those who had not yet succumbed to the Duke's influence or the general pandemonium, began to gather around him. Their numbers were significantly smaller than he had anticipated, a sobering testament to the pervasive reach of his uncle's machinations. The journey back to the castle was a tense affair, the usual celebratory atmosphere replaced by a chilling silence, punctuated by the anxious glances of Henri's retinue. Within the castle walls, the news of Gareth's defection spread like wildfire, fueling anxieties and debates in every chamber and corridor. The royal council, already fractured by internal politics, now found itself facing an even greater crisis. The Duke's audacious move had shifted the balance of power dramatically, leaving Henri in a precarious position. His uncle's strategy was clear: to demonstrate that he commanded greater loyalty, greater influence, and therefore greater claim to authority than the young king himself. Henri retreated to his private chambers, the opulence of his surroundings doing little to assuage the gnawing fear in his gut. He had faced a direct challenge, a public repudiation of his kingship, and he knew this was only the beginning. The jester's words, once dismissed as fanciful pronouncements, now seemed like dire prophecies. He could no longer afford to trust the outward displays of fealty. The true measure of loyalty lay hidden, a secret whispered in the shadows, a promise made to a rival power. The fragile art of the royal gambit had taken a brutal turn, and Henri was acutely aware that his uncle had just made a move that had irrevocably altered the game. The path forward was fraught with peril, and he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that he would have to rely not just on strategic alliances, but on his own charisma, his own ability to inspire true devotion, to navigate the treacherous currents that now threatened to engulf his reign. The spectacle of shattered lances and fallen banners on the jousting field was a stark metaphor for the fragility of his own power. The reverberations of Sir Gareth's ignominious defection were not confined to the dust-choked jousting field. In the hushed solemnity of the royal chapel, where the scent of beeswax and ancient stone clung to the air, King Henri found himself facing a different, yet no less potent form of opposition. Bishop Elric, a prelate whose pronouncements carried the weight of divine authority, sat before him, his robes a deep, resonant crimson that seemed to absorb the very light of the stained glass windows. The flickering candlelight danced across his serene face, a mask of piety that Henri knew masked a mind honed by decades of strategic maneuvering within the labyrinthine corridors of the church. "Your Majesty," Bishop Elric began, his voice a low, melodious rumble that resonated with the sanctity of his office. "We are heartened by your devotion. The recent, unfortunate events at the tournament underscore the urgent need for spiritual reinforcement. The very fabric of our kingdom, your kingdom, is threatened by the insidious seeds of discord sown by those who place worldly ambition above divine will." Henri shifted on the prie-dieu, the hard wood of familiar discomfort. He had sought counsel, or at least an outward show of support, from the church in the wake of Armand's audacious display of power. Instead, he found himself ensnared in a web of theological argument, a subtle but unyielding pressure to cede ground on matters that had been hard won by his predecessors. Bishop, Henri replied, his voice carefully measured. I understand the gravity of the situation. The loyalty of my knights is paramount, and the Duke's actions have, I admit, exposed certain vulnerabilities. He chose his words deliberately, avoiding any direct accusation against Armand, lest he give the bishop further leverage. However, my current concern is securing the northern borders. The raids are increasing, and our resources are strained. I had hoped for the church's endorsement of a more robust approach. Bishop Elric's hands, clasped before him, moved almost imperceptibly. The subtle gesture seemed to draw focus to the heavy, jewel encrusted crucifix that hung at his throat. Divine will, Your Majesty, dictates not merely the deployment of swords, but the righteousness of the cause. We, the shepherds of the flock, must ensure that our actions are guided by Scripture, not by the fleeting passions of men or the perceived necessity of war. He paused, allowing his words to settle like dust motes in the sunbeams. The Council of Elders at Rome, in their infinite wisdom, has decreed that certain territories, particularly those bordering the unfaithful, are to be treated with caution. Direct military engagement, especially when initiated by a Christian king against those who may yet be persuaded towards the light, carries significant spiritual peril. The Holy Father himself has expressed his deep concern over any actions that might be construed as aggressive appropriation of lands that in time could be brought into the fold through peaceful conversion. Henri felt a prickle of annoyance. This was precisely the kind of ecclesiastical obfuscation he had come to dread. Peaceful conversion, he echoed, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Bishop, these are not territories to be persuaded. These are lands that have been systematically plundered, our people brutalized. The northern tribes have shown no inclination for peaceful conversion. Their language is that of the blade and the torch. And yet, Bishop Elric countered, his gaze unwavering. Scripture teaches us patience. It teaches us to turn the other cheek. Furthermore, the financing of such an extended military campaign, involving as it would the levying of new taxes and the requisition of grain from church granaries, presents its own set of theological quandaries. The tithes owed to God must not be diverted to the coffers of war. Such actions could be seen as a direct affront to divine providence. The implication was chillingly clear. The Church, with its vast landholdings and its exemption from royal taxation, held immense power. To alienate it, to defy its pronouncements, was to invite a spiritual and political crisis that could unravel his reign more effectively than any rebellion. The Duke's betrayal, a stark physical manifestation of fractured loyalty, was now being mirrored by the insidious influence of ecclesiastical doctrine, a more pervasive, more suffocating form of dissent. Henri recalled the grand procession he had witnessed just weeks prior, when the relics of Saint Isidore had been paraded through the city. The streets had been lined with cheering crowds, the air thick with incense, and the fervent chanting of hymns. The bishop himself had led the procession, his face radiant with spiritual fervor, bestowing blessings upon the gathered masses. Now, that same figure sat before him, using the very institutions that inspired such devotion as a cudgel to bludgeon his king into submission. Says so, Henri said, his voice tight. You are telling me that the church will not support my efforts to protect my kingdom because it might inconvenience its finances, or because it might disturb some theoretical notion of peaceful conversion with people who have shown us nothing but violence? Bishop Elric inclined his head slightly. Your Majesty misunderstands. The Church's support is unwavering, but it must be tempered by obedience to God's law, as interpreted by his appointed ministers. The allocation of resources, the timing of military actions, these are matters that require careful spiritual discernment. Furthermore, any attempt to bypass the Church's authority, to unilaterally raise funds, or to engage in conflict without its blessing could be construed as heresy. And as you know, Your Majesty, the penalties for heresy are severe. They extend beyond the earthly realm. The unspoken threat hung heavy in the air, as palpable as the scent of the burning candles. Excommunication, the word never uttered aloud, nevertheless permeated the charged atmosphere. To be excommunicated was to be cast out, not just from the church, but from the fellowship of Christendom. It meant that any subject who obeyed an excommunicated ruler was also damning themselves, effectively dissolving the bonds of fealty and loyalty that underpinned the entire social and political order. It was a weapon that could cripple a kingdom from within, sowing chaos and rebellion under the guise of divine justice. Henri looked around the chapel, the ornate carvings of saints and martyrs seeming to watch him with silent, unyielding judgment. He saw not sanctuary, but a gilded cage. The church, a supposed pillar of his authority, had become an anchor, dragging him down into the mire of political expediency. He was caught between the overt rebellion of his uncle and the subtle but absolute power of religious dogma. What concessions? Henri asked, his voice barely a whisper. Does the church require to offer its discernment, its blessing on this matter? He hated himself for asking, for having to negotiate with spiritual power as if it were merely another ambitious duke. Bishop Elric's smile, if it could be called that, was a slight upturning of his lips, devoid of warmth. It is not a matter of concessions, Your Majesty, but of alignment with divine will. The Church requires assurance that your reign will be guided by spiritual principles, specifically the matter of the Abbey of St. Jude, whose lands were, you will recall, designated for royal use by your esteemed father. We believe a return of these lands to the Church, to be administered by the Order of St. Benedict, would be a significant step towards reaffirming your commitment to God's greater plan. It would ensure that these resources are used for spiritual advancement rather than for the potentially impious purposes of war. The Abbey of St. Jude. Henri knew the lands well, fertile, strategically located, and a vital source of revenue that had been earmarked for strengthening the northern defenses. To return them now, especially after his father's clear decree, would be a severe blow to his treasury and his military capabilities. It was a clear demonstration of the Church's power to use spiritual authority to reassert temporal claims, to reclaim what they saw as rightfully theirs, regardless of royal pronouncements. And what if I cannot, or will not, return the Abbey of St. Jude? Henri asked, his gaze hardening, the specter of Gareth's betrayal still fresh in his mind. What then, Bishop? Will you thunder damnation from the pulpit? Will you instruct your followers to withhold their tithes, their obedience? Bishop Elric steepled his fingers once more. Your Majesty, the Church's actions are guided by a higher authority than any earthly king. We act not out of spite or desire for temporal gain, but out of a profound concern for the spiritual well-being of your soul and your kingdom. Should you choose a path that diverges from God's law, the consequences will be a reflection of that choice, not a punishment inflicted by mortal hands. The scriptures are replete with examples of kings who defied divine wisdom and met with ruin. He let the implications settle, the subtle but devastating power of the Church's veiled threats hanging in the incense-laden air, the grandeur of the chapel, the solemnity of the prayers, all served to amplify the weight of his words. Henri found himself not merely negotiating, but facing a judgment, a spiritual gauntlet thrown down by an institution that could, with a single pronouncement, dismantle the very foundations of his authority. The art of the royal gambit had just revealed its most formidable player. The gilded walls of the royal palace, once a symbol of stability and enduring power, now felt like a gilded cage to King Henri. The skirmish with Armand, his erstwhile loyal uncle, had shaken him, exposing the brittle foundations of his authority. But it was the simmering disquiet within his own bloodline, a chilling whisper of ambition from his eldest son, that truly gnawed at his peace. Prince Alaric, barely a man at 17 years of age, possessed a spirit that chafed against the constraints of princely expectation, a youthful fire that threatened to consume the very kingdom he was destined to rule. Alaric, with his father's sharp jawline and his mother's striking azure eyes, was a young man of considerable charm and an even more considerable ego. He had grown up in the shadow of the throne, privy to the machinations of court, and had long since grown impatient with the slow, deliberate pace of his father's reign. He saw his father's caution not as wisdom, but as weakness, his measured diplomacy as dithering. The raids on the northern borders, the political maneuvering with the Church, these were not challenges to be navigated, but obstacles to be swept aside by a firm hand, a hand that Alaric believed was already ready to grasp the reins of power. The whispers began subtly, insidiously, like ivy creeping up ancient stone. They found fertile ground among the disgruntled nobles who felt overlooked, their privileges curtailed by Henri's fiscal policies, or their ambitions thwarted by his measured approach to foreign policy. These were men who remembered the more decisive rule of Henri's father, a king who had been less inclined to consult his council and more prone to issuing decrees. Alaric, with his youthful swagger and his easy pronouncements, seemed to embody that bygone era of kingly might, or at least the romanticized version of it that these lords clung to. One evening, as the last vestiges of sunset painted the sky in hues of bruised purple and dying ember, Alaric found himself in a secluded alcove within the palace's west wing. The air was thick with the scent of old parchment and stale wine. Beside him stood Lord Valerius, a man whose lands bordered the volatile northern frontier, a man whose reputation for pragmatism was matched only by his simmering resentment towards the current regime. Valerius, his face a roadmap of hard-won battles and political defeats, leaned in, his voice a low rasp. "Your Highness," Valerius began, the deference in his tone laced with a knowing glint. "Your father," he hesitates, while he debates scripture and appeases the bishop. "Our northern villages burn. The tribes grow bolder. This cannot continue." Alaric turned, his young face alight with a fierce, almost feverish intensity. His usually clear eyes held a spark of something dangerous, a fire that mirrored the ambition he harbored. "Hesitation, my lord," Alaric replied, his voice carrying a youthful resonance that nonetheless held a surprising authority, "is the luxury of those who do not feel the heat of the enemy at their gates. My father is a good man, a pious man, but piety does not forge swords, nor does it deter raiders." He paused, then leaned closer, his words dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "These nobles who find their voices stifled, those lords who feel their honor diminished, they look for a leader, someone who understands the true meaning of kingship, someone who will act, not just preside." Valerius's weathered face broke into a slow, calculating smile. He recognized the hunger in the prince's eyes, a hunger that could be manipulated, a force that could be directed. "And where does such a leader find himself, your highness?" Alaric's gaze swept over the shadowed arches, the opulent tapestries depicting glorious royal victories that felt to him like distant, irrelevant myths. "He finds himself at the precipice," Alaric said, his voice barely audible, "ready to leap. He finds himself with allies who understand that the strength of a kingdom lies not in parchment decrees, but in decisive actions." The conversation continued, a clandestine exchange of grievances and aspirations. Alaric spoke of his father's perceived weaknesses, his unwillingness to confront the church's temporal demands, his naivete in believing that diplomacy could appease those who understood only brute force. Valerius, in turn, spoke of the growing discontent among the military ranks, the officers who felt their valiant efforts were unappreciated, their pleas for adequate supplies dismissed by a king more concerned with the pronouncements of a bishop than the realities of war. "Imagine, your highness," Valerius continued, his voice weaving a tapestry of what-ifs, "a king who would march north with an army fueled by righteous fury, a king who would shatter the northern hordes, securing the borders not for a generation, but for centuries, a king who would sweep away the cobwebs of clerical interference, restoring the crown's true authority. Such a king would be more than a ruler, he would be a legend." Alaric's chest swelled. The vision painted by Valerius of himself as the conquering hero, the restorer of a glorious past, the unwavering champion of his people, was intoxicating. It was a far cry from the stifling confines of his father's court, where every decision was weighed, every consequence meticulously considered. He saw his father's approach as a slow suicide of the kingdom's potential, a betrayal of the very legacy he was meant to inherit. The following weeks saw Alaric more frequently absent from his father's side, his evenings spent in clandestine meetings with a growing circle of influential and often disgruntled lords. Among them was Baroness Isolde, a stern woman whose family had lost considerable land and influence during Henri's father's reign, a loss she had never forgiven. She was sharp-witted and fiercely ambitious, her loyalty extending only as far as her own advantage. Alaric found her counsel invaluable, her understanding of courtly intrigues and the subtle currents of power, a stark contrast to the blunt pronouncements of men like Valerius. Your father, Isolde observed one evening, her voice a silken whisper as she traced the rim of her wine goblet, is a man of conscience, a dangerous trait in a king, your highness, especially when that conscience is so easily swayed by those who wear the cross. He speaks of spiritual reinforcement. You should speak of martial strength. He listens to the bishop. You should listen to the soldiers and to those who understand how to finance their campaigns. Alaric, seated across from her in a dimly lit private chamber, nodded eagerly. He had already begun to cultivate his own network of supporters within the royal guard, men who admired his youthful vigor and saw in him a more decisive future than his father offered. He spoke of increased pay, of opportunities for advancement, of a glorious campaign that would bring him renown and them riches. The northern garrisons are understaffed and the men are poorly equipped, Alaric confided in Isolde. My father's treasury is strained by the demands of the church, but I have spoken to men who believe that if the crown were to offer substantial bounties for captured northern chieftains, and if certain confiscated assets from those who have shown disloyalty were to be redirected, then a vigorous campaign would be more than possible. It would be swift and glorious. Isolde raised an eyebrow, a flicker of admiration in her cold eyes. Confiscated assets? Disloyalty? You speak of Duke Armand's lands, perhaps, your highness. Alaric's jaw tightened. Armand's defection, his open defiance, was a constant irritant, but it also presented an opportunity. Armand has proven himself a traitor, Alaric stated, his voice firm. His lands, his wealth, these should be used to protect the kingdom he so readily abandoned, not to fund the church's pronouncements, but to secure our borders. My father, he added, a subtle bitterness creeping into his tone, seems unwilling to grasp this simple truth. The dynamic between father and son had become increasingly strained. Henry, sensing a subtle shift in Alaric's demeanor, the growing confidence that bordered on arrogance, the secretive meetings and veiled pronouncements, had attempted to draw his son closer. He invited Alaric to more council meetings, hoping to instill in him a sense of responsibility, the weight of leadership. But Alaric's participation was often marked by a restless impatience, a tendency to interrupt, to dismiss the carefully considered arguments of seasoned advisers with a wave of his hand. During one such council meeting, as Bishop Elric outlined the church's concerns regarding the financing of a northern expedition, Alaric had interjected, his voice cutting through the solemn atmosphere. With respect, your grace, he had addressed the bishop, his tone laced with a barely concealed disdain. While the spiritual health of the kingdom is indeed important, the physical health of its people is also paramount. We cannot allow the pronouncements of Rome to dictate our defense. Our people are being slaughtered while we debate the finer points of theology. If my father will not act, then perhaps a stronger hand is needed. The room had fallen silent, the words hanging in the air like a thunderclap. Henri's face had turned a dangerous shade of pale. He had seen the glint in Alaric's eyes, the unspoken challenge, the burgeoning conviction that he, the prince, was the true embodiment of the kingdom's needs. He had dismissed Alaric from the council that day, the dismissal sharp and public, a clear signal of his disapproval. But Alaric, far from being chastened, saw it as further proof of his father's inadequacy. He interpreted the reprimand not as a father's concern for his son's insolence, but as a king's fear of a more capable successor. He began to openly question his father's decisions among his trusted circle, framing Henri's caution as cowardice, his diplomacy as appeasement. He spoke of a restoration of royal authority, of purging the court of weak counselors, of reclaiming the kingdom's destiny. The younger courtiers, drawn to Alaric's charisma and his bold pronouncements, flocked to his banner. They saw him as the future, a refreshing counterpoint to the perceived stagnation of Henri's reign. They whispered of daring raids, of swift justice, of a kingdom reborn under a young, vigorous king. The older, more experienced nobles watched with a mixture of apprehension and calculated interest. Some saw an opportunity to advance their own agendas by aligning with the ascendant prince, while others, loyal to Henri, felt a growing dread as they witnessed the unraveling of royal unity. The fraught dynamics between Henri and Alaric were a constant source of tension, a silent battle waged within the very heart of the royal family. Henri, torn between his paternal love and his duty as king, found it increasingly difficult to reconcile his son's burgeoning ambition with the well-being of his kingdom. He saw the danger, the destructive potential of Alaric's impatience, the way it was being skillfully manipulated by those who sought to undermine his rule. One particularly tense evening, Henri summoned Alaric to his private chambers. The room was a sanctuary of sorts, filled with ancient maps and the comforting scent of pipe tobacco. Henri sat by the fire, the flames casting flickering shadows on his weary face. Alaric, Henri began, his voice low and measured. We need to speak. Your recent conduct, it is a matter of concern. You speak of action, of decisive leadership, but you do not seem to understand the consequences of such actions, the delicate balance required to maintain peace. Alaric stood before him, a picture of youthful defiance, his arms crossed. Consequences, father, or appeasement? While you debate, our people suffer. Duke Armand still commands his lands, emboldened by your restraint. The northern tribes continue their raids. Is this the legacy you wish to leave? Henri sighed, running a hand through his hair. The legacy I wish to leave is a secure and prosperous kingdom, Alaric, and that requires patience, strategy, and an understanding that not all battles are won by the sword alone. The church's influence, while at times frustrating, is a force that cannot be simply dismissed. Your Uncle Armand's actions have weakened our position, not strengthened it. And your own words, your open defiance, they create further instability. Instability, Alaric scoffed, is what happens when a king fails to lead, when he allows his authority to be undermined by advisors, by a foreign church. I am your son, father, and I am your heir. I see the threats that you seem determined to ignore. You see only a part of the picture, Alaric, Henri said, his voice tinged with a weariness that went deeper than mere fatigue. You see the immediate confrontation, the glorious victory. You do not see the long term consequences, the alliances that can be broken, the resentments that can fester. You are eager to inherit power, but you have not yet learned the burden of responsibility that comes with it. He rose and walked towards his son, placing a hand on his shoulder. You have a good heart, Alaric, and a strong spirit, but a kingdom is not built on youthful impetuosity. It is built on wisdom, on understanding, on a deep and abiding commitment to the welfare of all your subjects, not just those who cheer the loudest or wield the sharpest swords. Alaric shrugged off his father's hand, his gaze fixed on the flames of the fire, as if seeking answers in their chaotic dance. Wisdom, father, can also be found in recognizing when a new dawn is breaking and when the old ways have outlived their usefulness. My time will come, and when it does, I will not hesitate. The words hung in the air, a clear and present danger. Henri looked at his son, seeing not just the eager heir, but a rival, a potential usurper. The love of a father warred with the duty of a king, and in the quiet of his chambers, surrounded by the symbols of his authority, Henri felt a chill that had nothing to do with the encroaching night. The greatest threat to his reign, it seemed, was not the disgruntled uncle or the meddling bishop, but the unruly heir of his own blood, a prince whose ambition, if unchecked, could plunge the kingdom into a conflict far more devastating than any raid from the northern tribes. The royal gambit had just revealed its most perilous player, a prince whose youthful impatience held the power to unravel everything Henri had strived to build. The grand hall of the royal palace, usually alive with the hum of courtly gossip and the rustle of silk, now held a charged silence, punctuated only by the clinking of heavy silver against fine porcelain. Outside, the last rays of the setting sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens. But within, the air was thick with anticipation, a heady blend of expensive perfume, the faint scent of beeswax from the candelabra, and the distinct, promising aroma of aged wine. King Henri, his brow furrowed in a familiar expression of weary calculation, observed the scene from his raised dais. Across the expansive chamber, seated at a long polished oak table laden with overflowing ewers and crystal goblets, sat the delegation from the distant kingdom of Viridia. Their king, Arion the Stern, was known throughout the known world for his unyielding demeanor, a man carved from the same granite as his mountain kingdom. His envoys, however, seemed to possess a more relaxed disposition. Their eyes, rather than fixed on the king with respectful awe, were instead drawn to the generous decanters and the glistening glassware. Lord Valerius, ever the pragmatist, and now increasingly a confidant of Prince Alaric, had rightly identified the need to secure alliances, especially with the growing unrest in the north. Viridia, with its formidable army and strategic position, was a potential bulwark against any encroaching eastern powers, or worse, a formidable foe should they choose to side with Henri's enemies. The proposed alliance was to be cemented by a marriage contract, a union between Henri's youngest daughter, Princess Aurelia, and Arion's own son, Prince Theron, a delicate dance of power and lineage, and one that Henri was determined to see conclude favorably. The chief Viridian envoy, a portly man named Lord Boren, with a beard that seemed to have a life of its own, punctuated by streaks of gray like frost on a winter tree, was currently engaged in a spirited discussion with one of Henri's own cupbearers. So, my good man, Borin boomed, his voice carrying across the hall, a tone that suggested familiarity born from ample previous tastings. This vintage, it possesses a most remarkable bouquet. Is it from the southern vineyards, perhaps? The ones near the Azure coast? The cupbearer, a young man named Thomas, whose loyalty to the crown was unquestionable, but whose experience with Viridian diplomats was limited, stammered a reply, trying to keep his hands steady as he refilled Borin's goblet. Indeed, my lord, it is the king's personal reserve from the harvest of 78. A low murmur of appreciation rippled through the Viridian contingent. One of the younger envoys, a wiry man with shrewd eyes and a perpetually smirk, nudged Borin with his elbow. 780, you say? My lord, this is a wine that speaks of a king who understands true value. Better than the watery slop they served us in Ostia. Wouldn't you agree? Borin merely grunted, his attention already drifting to a fresh decanter of a deeper crimson hue. The negotiations, my dear fellow, are but a prelude to the true appreciation of a king's hospitality. One must lay a proper foundation, you understand. He gestured with his goblet, indicating Thomas. Another measure, if you please. The king's generosity is as renowned as his treasury, I am told. Henri watched this exchange with a carefully neutral expression, though inwardly he felt a prickle of annoyance. The Viridians were shrewd negotiators, and their apparent preoccupation with the wine was a deliberate tactic, a way to gauge his generosity, to sow seeds of expectation, and perhaps to distract from the less palatable clauses of the proposed treaty. He knew that King Arian, though absent, was a keen observer of his diplomats' reports, and any perceived slight or lack of generosity could sour the nascent alliance. Seated beside Henri, his chancellor, Master Elias, a man whose intellect was as sharp as the quill he perpetually held, leaned in. Your Majesty, Elias murmured, his voice a low rustle of parchment. Lord Borin seems to be thoroughly evaluating our vinicultural prowess. Might I suggest a more restrained offering? The treaty details are still under discussion, and a lavish display of hospitality may inadvertently set a precedent for their demands. Henri gave a curt nod, his gaze still fixed on Borin, who was now holding his goblet up to the candlelight, as if examining its very soul. Restraint, Elias, would be perceived as stinginess by a man like Borin. He would interpret a modest pour as a reflection of our dwindling resources, or worse, our disinterest. No, we must show them the strength and prosperity of our kingdom, even in our generosity. But, Henri's eyes narrowed slightly, we must also ensure they understand that this is a partnership, not a subsidy. The Chancellor of Viridia, a gaunt man with eyes like chips of obsidian named Ser Kalen, finally cleared his throat, his voice a dry rasp. Your Majesty, he began, his gaze finally lifting from the table, we have reviewed the proposed terms regarding the shared responsibilities for border defense. King Arion is amenable to contributing a contingent of soldiers, provided that the supply lines are guaranteed and that the crown of your kingdom assumes the majority of the logistical burden. Furthermore, Concerning the marriage of Prince Theron to Princess Aurelia, it is our understanding that a dowry of 50,000 gold crowns would be provided by your royal treasury. The figure hung in the air, a palpable weight, 50,000 gold crowns. It was a substantial sum, and coupled with the demand for logistical support on the northern front, it represented a significant drain on Henry's already strained coffers, especially with Prince Alaric's recent extracurricular expenditures for his loyalists. Henri felt a familiar tightening in his chest. He had expected negotiations, of course, but the Viridian's initial salvo was bolder than anticipated. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his own wine, a lesser vintage than that being so enthusiastically consumed by his guests, but still of impeccable quality. Lord Callan, Henri replied, his voice smooth and even. 50,000 gold crowns is a princely sum, and one that reflects the high regard we hold for King Arion and this proposed alliance. However, the logistical burdens of supplying troops on a volatile frontier is a considerable undertaking. The costs of provisions, transport, and maintenance are not to be underestimated. We must consider the shared commitment, perhaps a more balanced distribution of these responsibilities. Lord Boren, having seemingly reached a satisfactory conclusion regarding the wine's provenance, now turned his attention to the treaty, though his eyes still held a gleam of satisfied indulgence. Your Majesty, he interjected, his voice softer now, more persuasive. Consider the strategic advantage. The northern tribes, as you well know, are a constant threat. A unified front, with Viridia providing seasoned warriors, is an investment in mutual security. The burden, as you call it, is merely the price of peace, and as for the dowry, it is a symbol of the commitment your royal house makes to this union, a union that will bind our kingdoms for generations to come. King Arion believes that such a symbol should be substantial. He gestured towards a nearby decanter. If I may, Your Majesty, a small increase in the bounty for each captured northern chieftain would also be a welcome addition to the treaty. My men are brave, but their efforts deserve commensurate reward. Henri's mind raced. The dowry was one thing, but the demand for increased bounties on top of the logistical support was pushing the boundaries of his financial capabilities. He glanced at Prince Alaric, who was seated a few places away, observing the proceedings with a detached amusement that Henri found increasingly disquieting. Alaric's presence was a formality, a display of familial unity for the Viridian delegation, but Henri knew his son's mind was far from this hall. He was likely already planning his next clandestine meeting, his next subtle manipulation. An increase in bounties, Lord Boren, Henri said, his voice carefully measured, would require careful consideration of the kingdom's overall budgetary constraints. We are, as you know, already allocating significant resources to the defense of the northern borders. Perhaps we can discuss alternative forms of compensation or a phased increase contingent upon the successful deployment of your forces. Lord Boren's jovial demeanor shifted subtly. A flicker of something harder, more calculating, passed through his eyes. Your Majesty, he said, his voice losing some of its earlier warmth. King Arion is a king of his word, and a king who expects the same from his allies. The terms are clear. The dowry is non-negotiable. The logistical support is a prerequisite for our full commitment. and my men deserve to know that their king values their lives and their sacrifices. We are not asking for charity, but for a fair exchange of commitment and reward. The air in the hall grew perceptibly cooler. The clinking of glasses seemed to take on a more ominous resonance. Henri felt the familiar pressure of his son's ambition, not just Alaric's, but the ambitious spirit of his entire kingdom, yearning for strength and security, a yearning that made his father's cautious diplomacy seem like a betrayal of their very identity. He knew that a perceived weakness on his part now could embolden not only the Viridians, but also the internal dissenters, the lords like Valerius, who were already whispering about decisive leadership and stronger hands. He looked at the Viridian envoys, their faces expectant, their goblets still waiting to be replenished. He could refuse, stand firm on his terms, and risk alienating a powerful potential ally, potentially pushing Viridia into the arms of his enemies. Or he could acquiesce, further straining his treasury, and perhaps setting a dangerous precedent for future negotiations. The wine, so generously poured, was beginning to taste like a bitter draught. Let us consider the matter further, Henri said, his voice regaining its authority. Smeet, the particulars of the logistical support and the exact figure for the bounty can be refined. However, the foundation of this alliance, the marriage between Prince Theron and Princess Aurelia, must be built on mutual respect and a clear understanding of shared responsibilities. I am willing to increase the dowry to 60,000 gold crowns, provided that Viridia commits a standing force of no less than 2,000 seasoned soldiers to the northern front for a period of 5 years, and that your kingdom shares in the ongoing supply costs, perhaps a 10% contribution. He watched their faces, searching for any sign of agreement. Lord Boren exchanged a glance with Lord Kalen, their expressions unreadable. The younger envoy, the one with the shrewd eyes, seemed to be suppressing a smile. 60,000 crowns is indeed generous, Your Majesty, Kalen replied, his voice still measured, and a standing force of 2,000 is a significant commitment. However, the 10% contribution to supply costs, King Arion might find that to be insufficient compensation for the risk involved. Perhaps a 5% contribution as in a pledge of reciprocal support should Viridia face its own territorial disputes. The negotiation had descended into a complex web of concessions and counter-concessions, each word carefully chosen, each gesture meticulously observed. Henri knew that Alaric was watching him, likely critiquing every move, every compromise. He could almost hear his son's thoughts, hesitation, weakness. Father doesn't understand the true nature of power. Henri took another sip of wine, the taste now sharper, more defined. 5%, Lord Kalen, he said, his voice firm, is a token gesture, and frankly, an insult to the magnitude of the resources we will be committing. However, he paused, letting the weight of his words settle. I am willing to meet you halfway, 7.5%, and in return for this concession, I expect a formal written guarantee from King Arion that Viridia will not engage in any diplomatic or military actions that could be construed as hostile towards our kingdom for the duration of this alliance. Furthermore, should any of the northern tribes seek to breach our shared borders, your contingent will be the first to meet them with all due haste. He saw a subtle shift in Kalen's posture, a slight tightening around the lips. Boren, however, seemed to be more focused on the prospect of another refill. Your Majesty, Boren boomed, catching Thomas's eye. This discussion is proving most invigorating. Another glass of that exceptional vintage would be most welcome. One cannot negotiate on an empty stomach, or indeed with an empty goblet. Thomas, looking slightly harried, hastened to comply. Henri watched the scene unfold, a knot of tension in his stomach. The fate of his kingdom, the security of his borders, the future of his daughter, all hinged on these hushed exchanges, these calculated displays of generosity, and the ever-present, persuasive power of the royal wine. He wondered, as he often did, if Alaric, in his eagerness to seize the throne, truly understood the delicate, often intoxicating art of diplomacy, the slow, patient weaving of alliances, the subtle dance of power that unfolded not on the battlefield, but in the hushed grandeur of halls like this, where a well-chosen word or a generous pour could avert war, or if misjudged, ignite it. The gambit was far from over, and the most dangerous player, he suspected, was still yet to reveal his hand, a hand that was currently reaching once again for the goblet. The negotiations would continue, lubricated by wine, fraught with peril, and observed by a prince whose ambition threatened to spill over the gilded rim of royal expectation. The weight of the crown was not merely symbolic, it was a physical reality, a tangible representation of the burdens a monarch carried. It was hammered gold, studded with a king's ransom, in emeralds, rubies, and diamonds, each gem glinting with a cold, hard light that seemed to mock the very warmth of the kingdom it was meant to protect. When placed upon King Henri's head during his coronation, it had felt less like a mark of divine right and more like a blacksmith's anvil, a crushing pressure that forced his gaze downwards towards the plush velvet of the kneeling cushion rather than outwards towards his subjects. The sheer mass of it was astonishing. 3 pounds of solid gold, perhaps more, adorned with a profusion of precious stones, each one meticulously set, catching the light from the hundreds of beeswax candles that flickered in the cavernous abbey. It was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, a testament to the kingdom's wealth and the artisan's skill, and utterly impractical for anything beyond remaining perfectly still on a throne. Henri, even in his youth, had possessed a sturdy frame, but the moment the archbishop's hands, trembling with age and reverence, had lowered the diadem onto his brow, a groan had escaped his lips, a sound that was thankfully lost in the resonant echo of the ancient stone walls. He had felt his neck muscles strain, his spine compress under the immense, uneven load. The ermine trim, meant to signify regal purity, felt like a collar of frozen silk, scratching unpleasantly against his skin, a constant, irritating reminder of the grandeur that was now physically pinning him down. And the robes. Oh, the robes were a saga unto themselves. They were spun from the finest silks, heavy with intricate embroidery in threads of gold and silver, depicting scenes of mythical beasts and the glorious lineage of his ancestors. Lined with the thickest ermine, they pooled around his feet like a frozen wave of white fur, an almost impossible barrier between him and the cold stone floor. The purpose of such attire, of course, was to project an image of invincibility, of a monarch whose very presence was a display of power and divine favor. But standing there, struggling to hold his head upright, Henri felt anything but invincible. He felt like a puppet, trussed up in a costume too grand, too heavy for the mortal man beneath. His arms, encased in sleeves of stiff brocade that were themselves embroidered with patterns that could snag on a stray splinter of wood, felt clumsy and useless. He tried to raise a hand, to offer a gesture of blessing to the assembled throng, but the sheer weight of the fabric, combined with the constrained cut, made the movement a laborious, awkward affair, more akin to a slow motion attempt to swim through treacle. The ceremony demanded that he process through the nave of the abbey, acknowledging the cheers of the populace who had been granted rare access to witness this sacred moment. But this was no simple walk. It was a slow, ponderous shuffle, each step a monumental effort. The hem of his robes, dragging heavily on the ground, threatened to trip him, forcing him to concentrate on the immediate task of not falling flat on his face, a humiliation that would have been far more damaging than any military defeat. The ermine lining, warm and luxurious in theory, was suffocating in the reality of the packed abbey. The air, thick with the scent of incense, sweat, and nervous anticipation, was amplified by the insulating qualities of the heavy furs. Henri could feel a sheen of perspiration beginning to slick his skin, a stark contrast to the cool, regal exterior he was expected to maintain. He caught the eye of Prince Alaric, who stood a respectful distance away, a picture of youthful grace and effortless composure in his own, albeit less ostentatious, courtly attire. There was a subtle, almost imperceptible smirk playing on Alaric's lips, a hint of amusement that did not go unnoticed by his father. Alaric, ever the pragmatist, had voiced his concerns earlier, albeit in hushed tones, about the impracticality of the coronation regalia. "Father," he had said, his voice low and conspiratorial, "must you truly wear the entire treasury of the kingdom upon your person? Surely a simpler robe, less encumbered, would allow you to better address your people." Henry, caught in the rigid traditions of the court, had dismissed his son's concerns as youthful impatience, a lack of understanding of the gravities of royal symbolism. Now, however, he understood Alaric's point all too well. The weight of the gold, the stifling embrace of the ermine, the scratch of the embroidered threads, these were not mere inconveniences. They were a deliberate statement. They were meant to awe, to intimidate, to impress upon the observer the immense power and wealth of the monarchy. Yet, in that moment, as Henri painstakingly navigated the aisle, his muscles aching, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps, all he felt was the crushing vulnerability of the man beneath the regalia. The symbolism was lost to him, replaced by a primal, uncomfortable awareness of his own physical limitations. He was a prisoner of his own grandeur. Later, during the feasting that followed the ceremony, the shackles of ceremony continued to bind him. He sat at the high table, the bejeweled crown replaced by a slightly lighter, though still substantial circlet. The ermine-lined robes, though slightly less voluminous than the coronation mantle, still presented a considerable challenge. The long, wide sleeves, designed for dramatic effect, made it nearly impossible to handle his food with any degree of grace. He found himself constantly pushing the fabric back, trying to gain access to his plate, the heavy silk slipping and sliding with infuriating ease. The intricate gold embroidery, so beautiful to behold, had a tendency to catch on the edges of his trencher, sending small cascades of nuts or slivers of roasted fowl tumbling to the floor. A particularly ornate gold necklace, designed to rest upon the shoulders of the robes, was so heavy that it began to chafe his neck. He shifted uncomfortably, trying to find a position that offered some relief, but the stiff fabric offered no purchase, no give. He could feel the heat building within the layers of silk and fur. The air, though circulating in the great hall, felt thick and stagnant around him, trapping the heat generated by his own body and the proximity of so many other bodies. He longed for a simple linen tunic, for the freedom to move without constraint, to eat without fear of spillage or snagging. His guests, accustomed to the more practical attire of their own courts, seemed to regard his struggles with a mixture of pity and veiled amusement. Lord Boren, ever the gregarious diplomat, managed a hearty chuckle as he watched Henri wrestle with a particularly stubborn piece of pheasant. "My king," he boomed, his own simpler velvet doublet allowing for much greater freedom of movement. "It seems the weight of the crown extends even to the dinner table. Perhaps a slightly less cumbersome ensemble for future feasts?" Henri managed a tight smile, forcing himself to ignore the prickle of irritation that Boren's remark evoked. "It is the privilege of kings, Lord Boren," he replied, his voice strained by the effort of keeping his tone light, "to bear the weight of responsibility, both in matters of state and in the symbols that represent them." But inwardly, he cursed the traditions that bound him, that turned simple acts, like eating, into a performance of endurance. The gold, the gems, the intricate weaving, they were meant to convey a message of power, but they served only to reveal his humanity, his susceptibility to discomfort and fatigue. The ritual of the coronation had been meticulously planned, every detail steeped in tradition and theological significance. The anointing with holy oils, the presentation of the regalia, the acclamation by the peers of the realm, all were designed to affirm Henri's divine right to rule. But the physical reality of those symbols, particularly the weight and stiffness of the garments, had been a stark and unwelcome revelation. The heavy, bejeweled crown, the suffocating ermine, the intricately embroidered robes, they were not just symbols of power, they were physical impediments, turning the sacred act of coronation into a trial of endurance. He remembered the Archbishop's words during the anointing: "Be strong and courageous." Henri had interpreted this as a call to spiritual fortitude. Now, he understood it also as a plea for physical resilience, a need to endure the sheer, oppressive weight of the outward signs of his office. The golden spurs, meant to signify his role as a warrior king, felt heavy and awkward on his ankles, hindering the graceful sweep of his ceremonial sword. Even the scepter, though exquisitely crafted, had a heft that made holding it, for extended periods, a test of grip strength. The symbolism was undeniable, the visual impact profound. The sight of the king, resplendent in gold and ermine, was meant to inspire awe and loyalty. But the reality for the man wearing those magnificent trappings was far less glorious. It was a constant battle against discomfort, a silent struggle against the very things that were supposed to elevate him above ordinary men. The scratchy wool of the inner lining against his skin, the stifling heat that clung to him like a second skin, the sheer, unyielding weight that pressed down on his shoulders and neck. These were the unseen burdens of kingship, hidden beneath the glittering facade. He looked at the hushed faces of his courtiers, their own attire a study in controlled opulence. They were, in their own way, bound by the same ceremonial shackles, though perhaps to a lesser degree. But it was the king who bore the ultimate weight, both literally and figuratively. The coronation was supposed to be the crowning glory of his life, a moment of ultimate triumph. Instead, for Henri, it was a stark reminder of how easily the outward symbols of power could become a cage, trapping the wearer in a gilded prison of expectation and discomfort. The weight of the crown was a constant, pressing reminder that while he ruled a kingdom, he was also, in many ways, a slave to its traditions, a prisoner of its grand, often impractical designs. The ceremony, meant to elevate him, had instead served to highlight the deeply human and surprisingly vulnerable man beneath the regal splendor, a man struggling to simply stand upright under the weight of his own magnificence. The king was never truly alone, not in the echoing vastness of his own castle, not in the hushed sanctity of his private chambers, and certainly not when venturing into the bustling courtyards or along the dimly lit corridors. Each step was a calculated risk, each shadowed alcove a potential ambush point. The weight of the crown, as he had discovered firsthand, was one thing. The unseen weight of a blade at his back, poised to end it all in a brutal, irreversible instant, was an entirely different and far more chilling burden. He walked now, not through the gilded halls of coronation splendor, but through the everyday arteries of his fortress. The stone underfoot was cold, worn smooth by generations of feet, servants, knights, courtiers, and the occasional condemned prisoner being led to their fate. The air was thick with the scent of damp stone, stale rushes, and the distant, ever-present aroma of wood smoke from the kitchens. It was a familiar environment, a place he had known since childhood, yet today it felt alien, imbued with a sinister new tension. His own guards, a phalanx of steel and leather, moved with practiced efficiency around him, their eyes constantly scanning, their hands never far from the hilts of their swords. But even their presence, a visible bulwark of loyalty, could not entirely dispel the gnawing unease. The silence was the worst. It wasn't a peaceful quietude, but a loaded stillness, pregnant with unspoken threats. Every creak of the ancient timbers, every distant clang of metal, seemed magnified, distorted into the imagined whisper of a drawn sword. Henri found his gaze drawn to the shadows, to the deep recesses where the torchlight dared not penetrate. He saw shapes coalescing, figures lurking just beyond the edge of perception. Were they merely tricks of the light, his mind conjuring phantoms from fatigue and paranoia? Or were they real, the silent assassins patiently waiting for the opportune moment? The uncertainty was a corrosive acid, eating away at his composure. He remembered the tales, whispered in hushed tones by his tutors, exaggerated by the garrison sergeants, and grimly acknowledged in private council meetings. The kings who had met untimely ends, not on the battlefield, but in the supposed safety of their own homes. Poison in a goblet, a dagger slipped between the ribs during a moment of distraction, a betrayal so swift and unexpected that it left no room for defense. These were not abstract historical footnotes. They were cautionary lessons etched into the very fabric of his kingship. His hand instinctively went to the hilt of his own sword, a reassuring weight against his thigh. It was a magnificent weapon, forged with the finest steel, its pommel inlaid with precious stones that glinted even in the low light. But its presence was more a symbol than a practical defense against a sudden, unprovoked attack from behind. How could he defend against a threat he couldn't see? The polished steel of his armor, while offering protection against a glancing blow, would do little against a well-aimed thrust to the throat or a swift, silent incapacitation. The weight of the crown was a constant reminder of his elevated status, his divine mandate. But this other weight, this invisible sword at his back, was a stark reminder of his utter vulnerability. It was the constant, gnawing awareness that his life, the life of the kingdom, hung by the thinnest of threads, a thread that could be severed by the hand of any disgruntled noble, any ambitious courtier, any desperate mercenary. He passed through the great hall, where servants bustled with preparations for the midday meal. The sounds of laughter, of clattering plates, of shouted orders, offered a brief, deceptive respite. But even here, amidst the mundane routines of the castle, his senses remained on high alert. A sudden silence, a collective intake of breath, the furtive glance of a servant, any of these could signal the arrival of danger. He felt like a performer on a stage, expected to exude an aura of unshakable authority, while beneath the surface his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Prince Alaric, ever the pragmatic observer, had once commented on this aspect of their shared inheritance. "Father," he had said, his brow furrowed with youthful concern, "how do you bear it? This constant watchfulness, this inability to ever truly let your guard down?" Henri had offered him the platitudes of kingship, the discourse on duty and sacrifice. But even then, he had seen the flicker of understanding in his son's eyes. Alaric, too, would soon learn to live with the sword at his back, a silent companion that would accompany him through every waking hour. The psychological toll was immense. The inability to truly relax, to savor a moment of peace, was a constant drain. Sleep offered little true escape. Even in dreams, the shadows seemed to lengthen, and the whispers of danger persisted. He found himself replaying conversations, scrutinizing every facial expression, searching for hidden meanings, for signs of disloyalty. Trust, that most precious and fragile of commodities, was a luxury he could rarely afford. Even those closest to him, those sworn to protect him, could harbor hidden resentments, secret ambitions that might one day manifest as a sharpened steel. He remembered the assassination of his uncle, King Theron, a brutal, swift affair carried out by his own captain of the guard, a man who had eaten at his table, who had shared his counsel. The betrayal had been as shocking as the act itself, a testament to the depths of human depravity and the ever-present reality of the sword at the back. The memory served as a stark, visceral reminder of the precariousness of his position. Henri quickened his pace, his boots echoing more loudly on the flagstones than he intended. He could feel the eyes of his guards on him, their professional vigilance a mirror of his own internal anxiety. They were trained to anticipate threats, to react to the slightest anomaly, but they were also men, susceptible to fatigue, to distraction, to the same insidious whispers of doubt that plagued him. The journey through the castle was a gauntlet, each corridor a test of his resolve. He forced himself to maintain a steady, unhurried gait, to project an image of unruffled calm. But inwardly, he was a tightly coiled spring, every nerve ending screaming with awareness. He imagined the glint of steel, the swift, silent movement of a shadow detaching itself from the wall. He felt the phantom sensation of a cold blade pressing against his skin, a precursor to the final, fatal thrust. The sheer absurdity of it all was not lost on him. He was the king, the divinely appointed ruler of a vast and powerful kingdom. Yet, he moved through his own stronghold like a hunted animal, perpetually on edge, perpetually vulnerable. The grandeur of his attire, the weight of his crown, the opulence of his surroundings, all these outward manifestations of power served only to highlight the stark reality of his physical insecurity. He was a target, a prize, and the world, it seemed, was full of hands eager to claim it by any means necessary. He reached the privacy of his solar, the heavy oak door closing behind him with a resonant thud. The room was furnished with rich tapestries depicting scenes of heroic battles, a deliberate, almost ironic counterpoint to the unseen conflict raging within him. He sank onto a cushioned bench, his hands still resting on his sword, his gaze fixed on the door. The silence here was more profound, more absolute, but the imagined whispers were louder now, echoing in the sudden emptiness. The sword at his back, a constant, unseen companion, felt heavier than ever before. It was the ultimate absurdity of kingship to possess such immense power, yet to be so utterly, terrifyingly exposed. And he knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was a burden he would carry until his dying breath. The gilded cage of kingship was a peculiar prison, one where the bars were fashioned not from iron, but from expectation, and the warden was the ever-watchful populace. The illusion of control, the carefully constructed edifice of absolute power, was a fragile thing, easily shattered by the slightest tremor of reality. Kings, like actors on a grand stage, were expected to project an unwavering aura of command, to deliver their lines with conviction, even when the script was being rewritten moment by moment by forces entirely beyond their ken. It was a performance, a masterful improvisation played out on the grandest of stages, where the stakes were not merely the king's reputation, but the very stability of the realm. Imagine, if you will, a king tasked with juggling flaming torches while blindfolded. Each torch represented a crucial aspect of his dominion: the treasury, the army, justice, diplomacy, the church, the peasantry. He was expected to keep them all aloft, to maintain a graceful, steady rhythm, all without the benefit of sight, relying instead on the feel of the handles, the heat of the flames, and the occasional shouted instruction from unseen advisors. A dropped torch, a stray spark, and the entire performance could go up in smoke, consuming not only him, but the very kingdom he sought to govern. This was the essence of medieval rule, a precarious balancing act, performed with immense personal risk. Take, for instance, the monarch presiding over a feast in his own hall. To the assembled lords and ladies, he appeared the epitome of regal authority. He sat at the head of the table, his plate piled high with roasted meats, his goblet filled with the finest wine. He laughed at the jests of his courtiers, offered pronouncements on matters of state, and dispensed favors with a magnanimous flourish. Yet, beneath this veneer of effortless control, 1,000 unseen dramas were unfolding. A subtle nod from a trusted adviser might convey news of a skirmish on the northern border. A whispered word from a lady in waiting could reveal a brewing conspiracy within the royal household. A hastily scribbled note passed across the table might warn of a sudden pestilence sweeping through a distant province. The king was expected to absorb this torrent of information, to process it, and to respond decisively, all without betraying the slightest hint of internal turmoil. He might have to dispatch a contingent of knights to the border, send emissaries to negotiate a truce, order the distribution of grain to the afflicted, and simultaneously placate a disgruntled baron who felt his honor had been slighted. All this while maintaining the jovial facade of a host enjoying a celebratory meal. The king was, in essence, a perpetually improvising actor in a play with an ever-changing script. He might be delivering a powerful oration on the virtues of chivalry, only to be interrupted by a messenger bearing dire tidings of a famine. His carefully crafted speech on divine right could be drowned out by the clamor of a riot in the city square, demanding bread or justice. In such moments, the pre-written pronouncements were useless. He had to react, to adapt, to pull his improvisational lines from the ether, drawing upon his wit, his experience, and perhaps a healthy dose of sheer desperation. The skill lay not in knowing all the answers, but in projecting the confidence that he did, in commanding the stage, even when the props were being rearranged behind him by unseen hands. Consider the king who, on a whim, decided to ride through his capital city, accompanied by a small retinue. The intention was to foster a sense of connection with his people, to be seen and admired. But as he moved through the narrow, winding streets, the carefully orchestrated procession could quickly descend into chaos. A runaway cart, a brawl breaking out in a tavern doorway, a sudden downpour of rain that sent citizens scurrying for shelter. Any of these mundane occurrences could disrupt the desired spectacle of royal progress. The king might find himself needing to intervene in a dispute, to offer comfort to a distressed citizen, or to simply navigate the muddy, treacherous thoroughfares. Each interaction was a miniature performance, a chance to reinforce or to undermine his image. A king who reacted with ill temper to a minor inconvenience would be remembered for it, his perceived lack of control amplified by the gossip that inevitably followed. Conversely, a king who handled a difficult situation with grace and compassion could win the hearts of those he encountered, adding another layer to his carefully constructed persona. The weight of this constant performance was immense. There was no room for genuine relaxation, no possibility of letting down one's guard. Every word, every gesture was scrutinized, analyzed, and judged. A moment of genuine emotion, grief at a loss, anger at an injustice, could be misinterpreted as weakness or a sign of instability. Kings learned to compartmentalize, to build walls around their true feelings, presenting only the polished, authoritative facade required by their role. They were masters of the art of the public smile, the measured response, the strategically deployed silence. This pressure to maintain the illusion of control extended even to matters of the heart and the hearth. Marriages were often political alliances, unions forged for the sake of consolidating power or securing an advantageous treaty. The king was expected to present a united front with his queen, to appear as a loving couple, even if their personal lives were fraught with discord. The birth of an heir was a moment of immense significance, a tangible symbol of the dynasty's continuity and the king's ability to secure the future. Yet, even this seemingly straightforward event could be fraught with political undercurrents. Was the child healthy? Would it survive infancy? Was the queen truly the father's wife, or had whispers of infidelity taken root? The king had to project confidence in his lineage to assure his subjects that the succession was secure, even as private doubts gnawed at him. The very architecture of the royal court was designed to facilitate this performance. The grand halls, the imposing throne, the elaborate ceremonies, all served to elevate the king, to place him on a pedestal above ordinary mortals. This physical separation reinforced the psychological distance, creating an aura of untouchability and awe. Yet paradoxically, this very grandeur could also highlight the king's isolation, his inability to truly connect with the people he ruled. He was the sun around which the kingdom revolved, but he was also a distant, solitary star, observed from afar. The nature of medieval warfare further compounded this challenge. While kings were often expected to lead their armies into battle, the reality of command was far from a simple matter of bravery and brute force. A king on the battlefield was also a conductor of an orchestra of chaos. He had to rely on the competence of his generals, the loyalty of his soldiers, the effectiveness of his supply lines, and the capricious whims of fate. A single tactical miscalculation, a moment of ill fortune, and an entire campaign could be lost. The king had to maintain his composure amidst the clash of steel, the screams of the wounded, and the acrid smell of blood and sweat. He had to inspire courage in his men, even when his own heart was filled with trepidation. His victory or defeat was not just a personal triumph or failure, but a reflection of his kingdom's fortunes, his ability to protect and expand its borders. Even the administration of justice was a form of theater. The king, as the ultimate source of law, was expected to preside over trials, to deliver judgments that were both fair and final. The courtroom was his stage, the litigants his supporting cast, and the assembled populace his audience. He had to listen patiently to testimonies, weigh evidence, and pronounce sentence with an air of gravitas. A king who appeared indecisive or biased would lose the respect of his subjects, undermining the very foundation of his authority. He had to embody the ideal of impartial justice, even when personal loyalties or political pressures might pull him in different directions. The king's relationship with the church also demanded a delicate performance. As God's anointed ruler, he was expected to be a devout defender of the faith. He had to participate in religious ceremonies, to show deference to the Pope and his bishops, and to uphold the doctrines of the church. Yet, the church also wielded considerable power, often challenging the king's authority and seeking to influence his policies. The king had to navigate this complex relationship, balancing his spiritual obligations with his temporal responsibilities, always mindful of the potential for excommunication or schism. He had to perform piety without appearing subservient and assert his royal prerogative without provoking the wrath of the Almighty. The illusion of control was therefore not a static state, but a continuous, exhausting effort. It was the ceaseless juggling of those flaming torches, the blindfolded performance of 1,000 improvisations. The king was never truly in control. He was merely the most skilled actor on the stage, the one who best managed to convey the impression of mastery over a realm of unpredictable forces. His power lay not in the absolute certainty of his actions, but in his ability to persuade others that his actions were guided by an unshakable will and an infallible wisdom. He was a symbol, a figurehead, a performer whose greatest asset was his capacity to convince the audience that the play, however chaotic, was unfolding exactly as intended. The absurdity lay in the fact that the more he strove to project an image of absolute control, the more he revealed his underlying vulnerability. The crown, so heavy with its symbolic weight, was also a burden of constant performance, a mandate to deceive even oneself into believing in a mastery that was in reality forever just beyond reach. The king was a prisoner of his own majesty, forever acting the part of the king, never truly able to be simply a man. The gilded cage of kingship, as we've seen, was less about gilded bars and more about the crushing weight of perpetual performance. Each king, from the mightiest emperor to the most beleaguered duke, was an actor on a global stage, his every utterance and action dissected by a populace that craved certainty and stability. This theater of governance, while seemingly rooted in a distant, almost mythical past, resonates with an uncanny echo in our own era. For while the crowns have been replaced by the podium, and the whispers of court intrigue by the roar of the 24-hour news cycle, the fundamental pressures of leadership, the relentless demand for a polished, reassuring facade, remain strikingly familiar. Consider the modern politician navigating the treacherous currents of public opinion. Their reign, though measured in electoral cycles rather than dynastic lines, is nonetheless subject to a scrutiny that would make a medieval monarch blanch. While a king might have been vulnerable to the pronouncements of a disgruntled baron or the sermons of an influential bishop, a contemporary leader faces the unblinking gaze of millions, amplified by the insatiable appetite of a global media. Every gaffe, every misspoken word, every perceived inconsistency is not merely noted, it is amplified, dissected, and often weaponized, broadcast across screens and devices with a speed and reach that medieval rumor mongers could only dream of. The medieval king, reliant on the slow spread of news through town criers and traveling merchants, had a degree of temporal insulation. A rumor of his illegitimacy or his supposed cowardice in battle might take weeks or months to truly permeate the kingdom, allowing him some breathing room to craft a counter-narrative, to dispatch loyalists to quell the whispers. But today, a single awkward photograph, a poorly timed tweet, can shatter months of carefully cultivated image in mere seconds, unleashing a torrent of online criticism and speculation that is both immediate and overwhelming. The nature of this public scrutiny itself has evolved, yet its essence, the demand for perfection and the unforgiving judgment of flaws remains constant. Medieval subjects, though lacking instantaneous communication, possessed a keen eye for the physical manifestations of royal competence. A king who appeared weak, ill favored, or demonstrably prone to vice was not merely seen as a flawed individual, he was seen as a flawed vessel for divine authority, a potential harbinger of misfortune for the entire realm. The coronation itself was a potent piece of political theater, imbuing the monarch with sacred aura. But this aura was fragile, dependent on maintaining the appearance of strength, piety, and wise counsel. Rumors, often spread with the deliberate intent of undermining rivals, could easily take root if the monarch's public persona wavered. Was the king truly the son of his father, or was his birth shrouded in the scandal of an illegitimate union? Such questions, if allowed to fester, could erode the very legitimacy of his rule, creating fertile ground for rebellion. The king had to not only be the king, but also perform the king, projecting an unwavering image of divinely ordained authority. His personal life, his health, even his perceived character traits were all public assets or liabilities to be managed with utmost care. In much the same way, modern politicians are trapped in a similar feedback loop of perception management. Their personal lives, once a relatively private affair, are now constantly under the microscope. A marital indiscretion, a financial impropriety, a past transgression, these are no longer matters that can be easily contained within the confines of a family or a close circle of advisors. The paparazzi, the investigative journalists, the ubiquitous social media, all act as relentless interrogators, seeking out any crack in the polished veneer. The politician, like the king, is forced to perform a constant balancing act, projecting an image of integrity and stability while simultaneously grappling with the messy realities of human fallibility. The stakes are undeniably high. A scandal can derail a career, cost an election, and even destabilize a nation. The king's illegitimacy could lead to civil war. The politician's perceived lack of character can lead to a profound erosion of public trust, impacting the very fabric of democratic governance. The medieval king's advisors played a crucial role in shaping his public image and managing the flow of information. These were the architects of his narrative, the gatekeepers of his reputation. They would strategically release favorable news, suppress damaging rumors, and ensure that the king's public appearances were carefully orchestrated to reinforce his authority. A skilled chancellor could draft pronouncements that soothed anxieties. A trusted bishop could lend a sermon that sanctified the king's actions, and a loyal seneschal could ensure that any public display of weakness was immediately countered by a demonstration of strength. The king was, in essence, the star of a carefully produced documentary, with his advisors acting as the directors, scriptwriters, and editors. Modern political communication teams serve a strikingly analogous function. They are the strategists who craft the candidate's message, the spin doctors who reframe negative news, and the media liaisons who manage press conferences and interviews. The tools may have changed, from parchment scrolls to teleprompters, from royal seals to meticulously edited campaign videos, but the underlying objective remains the same: to shape public perception and maintain control over the narrative. A presidential candidate's speech is not merely a spontaneous outpouring of ideas. It is the product of countless hours of research, writing, and rehearsal designed to resonate with specific demographics and to project an image of competence and leadership. The media, in this context, can be seen as both the modern equivalent of the rumor monger and the town crier. While providing a platform for the politician's message, it also acts as an unfettered conduit for criticism, analysis, and often outright antagonism. The inherent human element of ambition, fear, and cunning, so palpable in the medieval court, also finds its modern counterparts. The courtiers who vied for the king's favor, who whispered plots and forged alliances, were driven by the same primal desires for power and security that motivate political operatives today. The subtle arts of flattery, the strategic deployment of information, the manipulation of public sentiment, these were the weapons of choice in the medieval court, and they remain highly effective tools in the contemporary political arena. A medieval king might have been wary of a charismatic duke who harbored ambitions for the throne, much as a modern president might be cautious of a rising senator who is seen as a potential challenger. The desire to consolidate power, to outmaneuver rivals, and to secure one's legacy. These are timeless impulses that transcend the centuries, manifesting themselves in different guises, but with remarkably consistent underlying motivations. Consider the medieval king's struggle with succession. The birth of an heir was a moment of immense significance, a tangible reassurance of dynastic continuity. Yet this joy was often tinged with anxiety. The child's health, the queen's reputation, the potential for competing claims, all these factors could destabilize the realm. The king had to project an image of a secure and legitimate lineage, even if private doubts or external challenges threatened that image. He might commission genealogies, display elaborate portraits of his ancestors, and emphasize the divine sanction of his bloodline, all in an effort to solidify his position and ensure a smooth transition of power. Modern political transitions, while ostensibly governed by established electoral processes, are not immune to similar anxieties. The perceived legitimacy of an election, the potential for foreign interference, the very question of who will lead the nation. These are all subjects of intense public debate and at times profound uncertainty. Political campaigns are, in a sense, a modern form of dynastic struggle, with candidates vying to establish their right to govern and to secure the approval of the electorate, the modern people. The rhetoric employed, the imagery used, and the appeals made to national identity all serve to construct a narrative that justifies one candidate's claim over another's, mirroring the medieval king's efforts to legitimize his own right to rule. The fear of unrest, of contested results, and of a fractured populace are echoes of the medieval anxieties surrounding disputed successions. The medieval king's reliance on symbols and ceremony was not merely for ostentation, it was a vital mechanism for reinforcing his authority and projecting an image of stability. The coronation, the royal progresses, the elaborate court rituals, these were all designed to impress upon the populace the king's unique status and his indispensable role in the functioning of the realm. The very opulence of the court, while often criticized, served to underscore the king's power and the prosperity of his kingdom. In a similar vein, modern politicians understand the power of symbols and public events, inauguration ceremonies, state dinners, visits to military bases, appearances at national commemorations. These are all carefully choreographed spectacles designed to convey a particular message about leadership, national strength, and unity. The visual language of politics, from the design of campaign logos to the backdrop of a presidential speech, is meticulously crafted to create a desired impression. While the medieval king might have donned a crown and ermine robes to signify his authority, the modern leader might wear a precisely tailored suit, carry a specific flag, or stand before a symbolic monument, all contributing to a carefully constructed public persona. The challenge of maintaining an image of control in the face of unpredictable events is perhaps where the most striking parallels emerge. A medieval king could be thrown into disarray by a sudden plague, a devastating harvest failure, or the outbreak of war on a distant frontier. His ability to project calm and decisive action, even when grappling with unforeseen crises, was paramount. A king who succumbed to panic or despair would quickly lose the confidence of his subjects. He had to be seen to be the steadfast rock upon which the kingdom was built, even if that rock was being battered by immense waves. Modern leaders face similar existential threats, albeit often of a different nature. Economic recessions, natural disasters, terrorist attacks, global pandemics. These are the modern equivalents of the medieval king's unforeseen calamities. The pressure to appear in control, to offer reassurance, and to provide effective solutions is immense. The media, eager to capture every nuance of a leader's reaction, can amplify any perceived misstep, transforming a moment of human vulnerability into a national crisis of confidence. The politician, much like the king, is judged not only on their policy decisions, but on their emotional resilience, their ability to project an unwavering sense of purpose in the face of overwhelming adversity. The carefully crafted speeches, the public appearances designed to convey calm authority, the reliance on expert advice, these are all modern iterations of the medieval king's efforts to maintain the illusion of absolute control. The insidious nature of rumor and slander, a constant threat to medieval monarchs, has also found new and terrifying expression in the digital age. While a medieval king might have had to contend with whispered accusations of heresy or treason, today's leaders face the rapid proliferation of disinformation, conspiracy theories, and fake news. These narratives, often crafted with malicious intent, can spread like wildfire across social media platforms, poisoning public discourse and eroding trust in institutions. The medieval king's response might have been to silence the offending rumor monger through imprisonment or banishment. The modern leader's challenge is far more complex, involving the battle against anonymous online actors, the struggle to fact check at the speed of viral dissemination, and the difficult task of maintaining public faith in the face of deliberate attempts to destabilize. The very anonymity of the digital world offers a potent shield to those who seek to undermine authority, creating a virtual hall of mirrors where truth and falsehood become increasingly difficult to discern. Ultimately, the fundamental human drama of leadership, the eternal tension between the public persona and the private individual, remains unchanged. The medieval king, burdened by the immense weight of his crown, was both a ruler and a prisoner of his role. He was expected to embody an ideal, to be a figure of unwavering strength, wisdom, and piety. His personal desires, his private fears, and his moments of genuine human frailty had to be suppressed, hidden beneath layers of ceremony and pronouncement. This need to project an unattainable standard of perfection was a constant, exhausting performance. And so it is with the modern politician. They too are expected to be paragons of virtue, to possess an almost superhuman ability to manage complex issues, to inspire confidence, and to embody the aspirations of the nation. The pressure to conform to these idealized expectations, to constantly maintain a polished and reassuring image, is relentless. While the trappings of power have changed, the core challenge of leadership, the art of convincing the public that one possesses the wisdom, strength, and integrity to guide the ship of state, remains a remarkably consistent human endeavor. The ancient halls of power may have given way to the sterile corridors of modern government buildings, but the echoing whispers of expectation, the ever present gaze of scrutiny, and the enduring struggle to maintain the illusion of control are the timeless threads that bind the medieval monarch to the contemporary politician, revealing that the human heart of leadership, with all its ambition, fear, and cunning, beats with a remarkably familiar rhythm across the centuries. The king's new clothes might have been woven from silk and gold, but the modern politicians are tailored from carefully crafted sound bites and meticulously curated social media feeds, each designed to conceal the same vulnerable human beneath the regal or the political mantle. The performance, it seems, is eternal. The chilling laughter that echoed through the stone corridors of the royal apartments was not born of mirth, but of a profound, almost desperate recognition of the absurd. It was a sound forged in the crucible of survival, a defiant snort against the icy breath of mortality. For King Theron, the events of the preceding hours had been a stark reminder of the precariousness of his existence, a dance perilously close to the abyss. The glint of steel, the guttural cry of a dying assassin, the desperate clang of sword against sword, these had been the soundtrack to a night that had threatened to plunge the kingdom into chaos. Yet, as the dust settled and the immediate threat receded, replaced by the more insidious chill of lingering paranoia, it was a grim jest, shared in the flickering torchlight, that truly cemented the knight's grim triumph. He stood leaning against a scarred oak table, the rich velvet of his tunic stained with a dark, ominous hue that was not entirely wine. His personal guard, the grizzled veterans who had formed a living, breathing bulwark between him and the assassins, were gathered around him, their faces etched with weariness, but also with a shared, unspoken understanding. Sir Calin, his most trusted captain, a man whose scarred visage bore witness to a lifetime of battles, nudged a fallen goblet with his boot. "Your Majesty," he rumbled, his voice a low rasp, "it seems our esteemed guests were rather too eager to attend your funeral. Most impolite, wouldn't you agree?" A faint smile, more a baring of teeth than a genuine expression of amusement, touched Theron's lips. Indeed, Calin, one might even say they lacked punctuality, and a proper invitation to boot. He gestured with a hand that trembled almost imperceptibly. "I confess, I had rather hoped for a more spirited debate on matters of state, perhaps a reasoned discourse on taxation, or the proper distribution of grain. Instead, we are treated to a rather clumsy display of impromptu close quarters combat. A regrettable oversight on their part, I feel. The guards exchanged glances, their hardened faces softening with a shared dark humor. They had seen their king, the symbol of their kingdom, stripped bare of pomp and ceremony, reduced to a hunted man in his own palace. They had fought not just for a crown, but for the fragile thread of order that Theron represented, and in that shared struggle, a bond had been forged, stronger than any oath sworn on parchment. Perhaps, Your Majesty, piped up Torvin, a younger guard whose bravery often outpaced his years. They mistook your private chambers for the royal treasury, a common error, I'm told, for those with sticky fingers and dull wits. A low chuckle, deep and resonant, emanated from Theron. It was a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the room, a release of tension too profound to be contained by polite sighs. Sticky fingers and dull wits, he mused, the words rolling off his tongue like polished stones, a rather fitting epitaph for our late, unlamented visitors, though I suspect their primary motivation was less the treasury and more a rather unpleasant form of political discourse. Something about popular uprisings and the king's perceived detachment from the common man. Rather inconvenient, really, when one is trying to avoid a dagger in the ribs. The guards shifted, their shoulders relaxing slightly. The fear, the adrenaline, the stark proximity to death, it was all still there, a palpable presence in the room. But now it was being wrestled with, subdued by the simple yet potent force of laughter. It was a shared acknowledgement that their survival in that moment was as much a testament to fortune and the desperate courage of those who stood beside him as it was to his own supposed kingly grace. Theron surveyed his men. Their armor was dented, their faces streaked with grime and sweat, their eyes burning with the fierce light of those who had stared into the void and blinked not. He saw in them not just soldiers, but companions in this perilous journey of leadership. He had always understood that the weight of the crown was a burden best shared, not in policy or pronouncements, but in the quiet camaraderie forged in the face of adversity. It is a curious thing, Theron continued, his voice softer now, almost reflective. This business of kingship, one is expected to be a lion, always roaring, always unyielding. Yet, the greatest strength I find often lies in recognizing the absurdity of it all. To be surrounded by death, to stare into the eyes of those who wish you ill, and still find a reason to, well, to chuckle. He ran a hand over his weary face, the gesture surprisingly human and vulnerable. If we did not laugh, my friends, if we did not find these moments of levity, then what would be left? Despair? Fear? Those are the true assassins, the ones that poison the soul long after the blade has been sheathed. The shared laughter that followed was different from the king's initial outburst. It was quieter, more knowing, tinged with the melancholy of experience. They understood. They had all, in their own ways, faced the abyss. They had seen friends fall, witnessed unimaginable brutality, and still they had risen day after day to serve. This was not the laughter of men who had forgotten the danger, but of men who had learned to live with it, to even find a measure of defiant joy in their continued existence. One might even say, Your Majesty, Kalen ventured, his eyes twinkling with a hint of mischief that belied his stern countenance. That those assassins were rather poorly trained. Had they been truly dedicated to their craft, they would have ensured your departure was far more permanent and far less amusing. Theron let out another breath, a sound that was half sigh, half chuckle. A valid point, Captain. Perhaps their pay was insufficient, or perhaps they simply lacked an appreciation for a well-timed jest. A fatal flaw, I dare say. He straightened, a flicker of his regal bearing returning, not as a performance, but as an intrinsic part of his being. Regardless, we have survived, and that, in itself, is a victory worth acknowledging, even if it is with a rather dark and twisted sense of humor. He looked at each of them in turn, his gaze lingering on their faces, seeking confirmation, not of loyalty, but of shared understanding. In their weary eyes, he saw it, the silent acknowledgement that this grim humor, this ability to find a sliver of light in the deepest darkness, was not a sign of madness, but of profound resilience. It was the human spirit, defiant and irrepressible, refusing to be crushed by the weight of the world. The very act of surviving an assassination attempt was in itself a testament to the inherent fragility of power. Kings were not gods, they were men, subject to the same vulnerabilities as any peasant in the fields. And yet, they were expected to project an aura of invincibility, to be the unshakable pillars upon which the kingdom rested. This demand for unwavering strength, while understandable, often led to a dangerous disconnect between the public facade and the private reality. A king who displayed too much fear, too much doubt, risked undermining his own authority, inviting the very chaos he sought to quell. Theron, however, had always possessed a keen awareness of this paradox. He understood that true strength did not lie in the suppression of fear, but in its acknowledgement and ultimately its transcendence. To be able to stand before his guard, stained and weary, and share a grim jest about his own near demise was an act of profound courage. It was a declaration that he was not merely a symbol, but a man who could face death and still find the human impulse to laugh. We shall need to reinforce the palace defenses, Theron stated, his voice now infused with a renewed, albeit weary, resolve. And perhaps investigate the provenance of these particular disgruntled subjects. See if there's a pattern, a network, anything that might explain such a brazen attempt. He paused, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. But for tonight, my friends, let us simply acknowledge that we are still here, and that, in itself, is a remarkable feat. He met Kalen's gaze, a silent communication passing between them. They had weathered many storms together, this king and his guard. They had faced the battlefield, the plague, the whispers of conspiracy, and each time they had emerged, battered but unbroken. This shared understanding, this ability to find a moment of human connection amidst the brutal realities of their lives, was the true bedrock of their strength. The night was far from over. The investigations would begin. The paranoia would undoubtedly fester, and the shadows would continue to hold their secrets. But for this brief, fleeting moment, in the hushed aftermath of violence, there was a shared breath of relief, a communal acknowledgement of their survival. And in that shared dark humor, King Theron found not a fleeting comfort, but a deep, abiding strength. It was the laughter of those who understood the precipice, who had looked into the abyss, and for now had managed to turn away, carrying the scars, but not the crushing weight of despair. The king, weary but unbroken, managed a faint, knowing smile. It was a smile that spoke of battles won, of trials endured, and of the enduring, absurd, and ultimately triumphant human spirit. It was the smile of a king who understood that sometimes the greatest weapon against the darkness was not a sharpened sword, but a shared, defiant laugh. And in that simple, yet profound act, he found not the end of his reign, but a renewed testament to his will to continue, to lead, and to survive, even in the face of the abyss. This was the true, unvarnished core of kingship, not the divine right, nor the inherited title, but the raw human capacity to endure, to find light in the darkness, and to meet the gravest threats with a flicker of defiance in the eyes and a grim joke on the lips. It was a testament to the unyielding resilience of the human spirit, a spirit that could find levity even when staring into the very maw of oblivion. The king, with his stained tunic and his weary smile, was a living embodiment of that enduring truth.